Chapter 1. The Whisper of Anatolia in the Stillness of Dawn. A pale mist clings to the rolling plains of Anatolia. The air is crisp, and the grasses sway gently, whispering secrets to the winds. Beyond the mist, ancient stones stand in silent vigil, crumbling walls and faded mosaics, remnants of Byzantium, a proud empire now gasping its last breaths. Time has dulled the grandeur of these ruins, but the shadows they cast are long. Stretching across the land like fading memories, Anatolia is a land of crossroads, where empires have risen and fallen, where kings have crowned themselves in glory, only to be forgotten. Romans once marched through these plains, their legions clad in bronze, their standards shining in the sun. The Byzantines built grand cities, with domes that touched the sky, but even they now crumble, their mosaics chipped, their columns fractured. This is a land of stories, of broken dreams, and forgotten glories, but amidst the silent decay, life stirs. A small tribe, humble and unassuming, moves with quiet purpose. They are the Oghuz Turks' wanderers who carry their homes on their backs and their stories in their hearts. Simple tents of leather dot the plains, and smoke rises gently from their fires. Men, wrapped in furs, speak in hushed tones, their faces weathered by the wind, while women weave, their laughter a soft balm against the cold. This tribe is not marked by riches or splendor. They have no grand cities, no marble halls. Their wealth is in their spirit, in the stories they pass from father to son, from mother to daughter. They are survivors resilient, unbroken. Among them walks a young man, his gaze sharp, his steps steady. His name is Osman, a name that will one day echo across continents. But for now, he is just a man among many, a leader without a kingdom, a dreamer without a crown. Yet there is something in his eyes, a quiet fire, a sense of purpose that sets him apart. He looks at the mist-shrouded ruins of Byzantium, not with fear or reverence, but with a quiet curiosity. He sees not just stones, but possibilities. For while others see only the past in these ruins, Osman sees the seeds of a future. The dream of Osmanite falls over the plains of Anatolia, and the tribe gathers around the crackling fires. Stars scatter like silver dust across the vast sky, and the moon hangs low, bathing the land in a gentle, silvery glow. Osman sits quietly by the fire, his eyes lost in the flickering flames. The elders tell stories of heroes and ancient kings, of battles won and empires lost. But as the night deepens, Osman drifts into sleep, his head resting on the soft earth, and it is in this sleep that a dream comes to him, a dream that will shape his destiny. He stands beneath a great tree, its trunk thick and ancient, its branches stretching high into the heavens. Leaves of emerald green shimmer in the starlight, and each leaf seems to hold a world of its own. The tree's roots spread far and wide, touching mountains, rivers, and seas. Birds of every color nest among the branches, their songs a gentle, soothing chorus. Beneath the tree, the earth is rich and fertile, and golden rivers flow, sparkling like liquid sunlight. But it is not just a tree, it is a vision, a symbol of greatness. Osman sees himself beneath its shade, his people gathered around him. Cities rise in the distance, their towers touching the sky. Ships sail the golden rivers, their sails filled with a gentle breeze. Armies march beneath banners that shimmer in the sunlight. Their armor bright and proud, Osman awakens with a start, his heart pounding. The fire has burned low, its embers glowing like scattered stars. The night is still, the tribe sleeps peacefully, unaware of the vision that has stirred their young leader. But Osman cannot forget the dream. It is more than just a vision, it is a promise, a whisper of destiny. With the first light of dawn, Osman rises, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He carries the dream in his heart, a dream that will guide him, that will transform a humble tribe into an empire. The rise of the Gazisman's vision does not remain a silent dream. It becomes a flame that burns within him, a call to action. His tribe, once content with a simple life, now follows him with newfound purpose. They are no longer just wanderers, they are warriors. They become the Ghazis, the holy warriors, fighters for faith, for honor, and for a future yet to be. Written, the frontier lands of Byzantium, once proud and unyielding, are now shadows of their former glory. Fortresses stand, but their walls are cracked, their garrisons thin and weary. Osman sees this weakness, and where others see ruins, he sees opportunity. His Ghazis strike swiftly, their raids like lightning sudden, fierce and unstoppable. Villages are taken, fortresses crumble, and the Byzantine lords tremble. But for Osman, this is not just conquest, it is a cause. His warriors do not fight for gold or glory alone. They fight for faith, for the promise of a better tomorrow, for the dream that burns within their leader. And that dream is no longer just Osman's, it is theirs. The Ghazis become legends. In the land, their swords sharp, their faith unshaken, the plains of Anatolia become a canvas, and Osman's Ghazis paint it with fire and steel. Each victory is a step forward, each fortress taking a new chapter in their story. But even in the heat of battle, Osman remembers his dream, the great tree, its branches spreading far and wide. And with each victory, he feels that dream becoming a reality. The first flames of emperors pass, and the Ghazis do not falter. Osman's name spreads across Anatolia, whispered with awe and respect. His tribe grows, no longer just a wandering band, but a force to be reckoned with. Villages rally to his banner, lords swear fealty, and the lands of Byzantium continue to crumble beneath his march. But Osman is not just a conqueror, he is a builder. Each village taken becomes part of a greater whole. Laws are written, markets flourish, and the people live not in fear, but in hope. The small campfires of his tribe become bustling towns, and the mist-shrouded ruins of Byzantium are replaced by new fortresses. Strong and proud, yet through all of this, Osman remains humble, his gaze always on the horizon. He knows that what he has built is just the beginning, a spark that will one day become a flame that will light the world. His dream, once just a whisper beneath the stars, is now a living promise, and so, beneath the skies of Anatolia, amidst the whispers of the plains and the shadows of ancient ruins, the first flames of an empire are kindled. The name of Osman becomes a legend, but the dream is just beginning. Chapter 2, The Shadow of Byzantium. The soft light of dawn washed over the Anatolian plains, a pale mist clinging to the grass, whispering in the cool breeze. But the tranquility of the land hid a darker truth. The gentle winds carried whispers of war, of threats that loomed on all sides. For the Ottomans, the death of Osman was not just the loss of a leader, it was the loss of a guiding light. And in the shadow of his absence, a young leader stepped forward, Burdened by a dream far larger than himself, Orhan, son of Osman, stood at the edge of a world poised between hope and despair. His father's victories had sparked a flame, but that flame now flickered in the wind. Around the fragile Ottoman state, powerful enemies closed in like wolves. To the east, the mighty Seljuks cast a wary eye. To the west, the proud Byzantines, though weakened, still stood like a wounded beast, lashing out with desperate strength. The mountains whispered of raiders, and the coasts told tales of enemy ships prowling the waves. Orhan was not his father. Where Osman had been a firebrand, a dreamer with a sword, Orhan was quieter, thoughtful. But he was not weak. Beneath his calm exterior burned a fierce resolve, a determination to preserve what his father had built. His first steps were cautious, like a man walking on thin ice. He strengthened his alliances, married the daughter of a Byzantine lord, hoping to bind his enemies with bonds of blood. He forged pacts, traded, and listened more than he spoke, but diplomacy alone could not hold the wolves at bay. The Ottoman lands were still a patchwork of villages, a quilt stitched by hope, but torn by fear. Orhan's warriors were fierce, but they were few, and their faith alone could not shield them from a blade. Orhan knew that for his people to survive, they needed more than hope. They needed a home, a true capital, a fortress against the darkness, and so his gaze turned to Bursa, the Byzantine city that stood like a jewel amidst the mountains. To take it would be to plant the Ottoman flag in history, to transform a wandering tribe into a rising state. But to fail would be to invite ruin. The siege of Bursaith walls of Bursa loomed against the sky, their ancient stones bathed in the pale light of dawn. The city was proud, a jewel of Byzantium, its towers crowned with golden domes, its streets winding beneath a canopy of lush green. Within those walls, merchants traded spices and silks, priests chanted in echoing halls, and the people lived. In the shadow of an empire that refused to die, but outside those walls, a quiet storm gathered. Orhan's warriors encircled the city, their banners fluttering in the breeze. They were not an army of glittering knights or grand legions. They were the Ghaz's warriors hardened by the wind and sun, their armor a patchwork of leather and iron, their swords sharp, their eyes sharper. They did not boast, nor did they fear. For each of them, this was not just a siege, it was a test of faith. Days turned to weeks, and the walls of Bursa seemed unyielding. The Byzantine defenders stood resolute, their arrows raining down from the battlements, their courage unwavering. Inside the city, the people prayed, their hopes rising and falling like the morning mist. But Orhan was patient. He did not waste his warriors on reckless assaults. Instead, he wove a net around the city, blocking the roads, cutting the supply lines. Hunger became an ally, cold a weapon. The fires of the city's kitchens burned low, the markets emptied, and whispers of fear began to replace the hymns of faith. The defenders, once proud, grew weary. The songs of the priests became quiet murmurs, and the golden domes of the city seemed less radiant, their shine dulled by smoke and despair. But even as the city withered, Orhan's warriors remained steadfast. The cold bit at their faces, the wind howled, but they stood like shadows, patient, unyielding. And at last the gates of Bursa opened, not with the roar of battle, but with the whisper of surrender. Orhan entered the city, not as a conqueror drenched in blood, but as a builder, a leader who offered peace, not ruin, Bursa became more than just a city. It became the heart of a growing dream, a symbol of resilience, of patience, of faith rewarded. It was no longer just a jewel of Byzantium. It was the first jewel of the Ottoman crown, the birth of the Janissaries, but Orhan knew that a city was not enough. Walls could be built, and markets could thrive, but an empire needed more. It needed strength of force that could stand against the might of enemies, a force bound by loyalty, not just to gold or land, but to a cause. And so he looked beyond tradition, beyond the ways of his forefathers, and dared to dream of something new from the Christian lands beyond the mountains. Young boys were taken not as slaves, but as a tribute, a sacred offering. They were brought to the heart of the Ottoman realm, where they were raised, trained, and transformed. They became the Janissaries, the new warriors of the Ottoman state. These boys, once strangers, became brothers. Clad in white tunics, their heads wrapped in simple cloth, they were taught the ways of the sword and the bow, the wisdom of the Quran, and the discipline of faith. They were not just soldiers, they were a brotherhood. Their loyalty was not to gold, not to lords, but to the Sultan, to the dream of a united realm. Their training was harsh, their discipline strict. They learned to march as one, to fight as one, to live and die as one. In battle, they were a wall of steel, unyielding and fearless. And in peace, they were guardians, a silent reminder that the Ottoman state was not just a kingdom, it was an idea, a promise, the world whispered. Of this strange new force, this army of faith, born from the sons of strangers. But to the Ottomans, they were not strangers. They were the Janissaries, the iron heart of a growing empire, the march across the Dardanelles with Bursa secured, and the Janissaries at his side. Orhan's gaze turned to the west, where the blue waters of the Dardanelles shimmered beneath the sun. Beyond them lay a new world Europe, a land of kingdoms and empires, a world ripe with danger, but also with promise. The winds over the Dardanelles whispered of ancient conquests, of Greek galleys and Roman triremes, of battles long forgotten. But Orhan's warriors were not deterred. They were men of the plains, but the sea did not frighten them. Ships were built, their sails catching the gentle breeze. The Janissaries, their white tunics bright against the sky, stood upon the decks. Their eyes fixed on the distant shores, as the first boats touched the European coast, a new chapter began. The Ottoman flag rose on the windswept cliffs, its crescent moon shining against the clear blue sky. Villages fell, and fortresses trembled. But Orhan did not seek destruction, he sought a bridge, a gateway. The Ottomans did not come as mere raiders, but as builders, dreamers whose dreams now stretched beyond the waters, and in the cool breeze of the European dawn, the Ottomans became more than just a wandering tribe, more than a rising state. They became a force, a shadow that stretched across mountains and seas, a whisper that grew into a storm beneath the shadow of Byzantium. The Ottomans did not just survive, they grew. From the quiet plains of Anatolia to the echoing halls of Bursa, from the white tunics of the Janissaries to the waves of the Dardanelles, their story was no longer just a tale of struggle. Chapter 3, The Crescent over Europe. The sun rose softly over the waters of the Dardanelles, its pale light spilling across the gentle waves. Mist clung to the surface, curling and dancing like a silent ghost. Beyond the mist, a shadow stretched. Across the sea, the shadow of ships, their sails swelling with the cool breeze, their wooden hulls cutting through the silver waters. At their head, a banner fluttered, a crescent moon, silver against a field of deep green. This was not just any fleet. It was the fleet of Sultan Murad I, a man whose quiet resolve hid a fierce ambition. The ships were filled with warriors, their faces set with calm determination. Some were young, their eyes wide with the thrill of adventure. Others were seasoned, their hands scarred, their gazes steady. They were not just an army, they were the Ghazis, the warriors of faith. The vanguard of a dream, their destination lay across the waters Gallipoli, a fortress of Byzantium, a gateway to Europe. To the Byzantines, it was a bastion, a shield that guarded the entrance to the continent. To Murad, it was a door that needed to be opened. The siege of Gallipoli did not begin with the roar of cannon or the crash of swords. It began with the quiet patience of men who knew that time was their ally. Murad's warriors encircled the fortress, their ships cutting off the sea, their camps dotting the hills. Days became weeks, and the walls of Gallipoli stood tall, their defenders brave but weary. Food grew scarce, hope began to wane, and the songs of the priests within the walls grew quieter with each passing dawn, but Murad's resolve never wavered. He knew that stone walls were not just built with strength, but with faith, and faith could falter. It was not the sword that broke Gallipoli, it was the whisper of fear, the silence of hunger. At last, the gates opened, not with the roar of battle, but with the quiet surrender of a city whose strength had withered. Murad entered Gallipoli not as a destroyer, but as a conqueror who brought not just swords, but laws. The churches were left standing, their bells allowed to ring. The people were not cast out, but offered protection. The crescent rose over Gallipoli, but beneath it, life continued. And the world saw, with a shiver, that the Ottomans were no longer just a distant threat. They were a force that had crossed the waters, a shadow that now touched Europe's shores. The defiant kingdoms, the shadow of the crescent, did not stop at Gallipoli. It spread like the quiet advance of a morning mist, seeping into the valleys and mountains of the Balkans. To the north, proud kingdoms stood beneath their own banners: Serbia, Bulgaria, Wallachia. These were lands of ancient forests and steep mountains, lands where kings ruled with iron crowns and swords spoke louder than words. But now those kings looked south with a growing unease. From their hilltop fortresses, they saw the silver banners of the Ottomans marching, the Ghazis riding like whispers of doom. Fear spread like a quiet plague, its roots deepening with every tale of a village taken, a fortress fallen. The fields of Europe, once quiet, now echoed with the thunder of hooves, the cries of battle, and the whisper of prayers, but fear did not bring unity. The kingdoms of the Balkans were proud, each jealous of the other, each a rival in times of peace. Kings whispered of alliances, but their swords remained pointed at each other. Serbia's King Lazar, a man of fierce pride, saw in the Ottomans not just a threat, but a challenge. Bulgaria's Tsar Shishman weighed his options, his court filled with whispers of betrayal. In Wallachia, the dark forests hid warriors who struck like shadows, but whose loyalty was as fleeting as the mist. Yet the Ottomans were not just warriors. They were builders, diplomats who offered peace to those who bowed, strength to those who joined. Some kingdoms bent, their banners lowered, their kings offering tribute. Others raised their swords, their lands becoming battlefields, their villages turning to ashes, But in the heart of these mountains, a storm gathered, a storm that would break not just on fields of green, but in the hearts of men who would stand and fall beneath the shadow of the crescent. The battle of Kosovoit was a dawn shrouded in mist, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and wildflowers crushed beneath the feet of marching men. Across the field of Kosovo, the banners of Serbia and the Ottoman Empire fluttered in the cold breeze. The sky was gray, a vast ceiling of cloud that seemed to press down upon the earth, a silent witness to the clash that was to come. On one side stood the forces of Prince Lazar of Serbia, his knights in armor that gleamed even beneath the pale light. Proud banners of crimson and gold danced above them, the lions and crosses of a kingdom that stood defiant. Their faces were hard, their swords sharp, their faith unwavering. On the other side, beneath the silver crescent, stood the Ottoman warriors. The Janissaries in their white tunics, their faces calm, their spears steady. Behind them, Murad I, the Sultan, watched with quiet resolve. He was not just a leader, he was a symbol, a dream that had crossed mountains and seas, a dream that now stood at the edge of a battlefield. The battle began with the whisper of arrows, the clash of swords, the thunder of hooves. The fields of Kosovo became a sea of chaos, men fighting, falling, crying out beneath the shadow of gray clouds. But it was not just a clash of armies, it was a clash of faiths, of dreams. In the midst of the chaos, Sultan Murad I was struck down. The news spread like wildfire. The Sultan was dead. But even in death, Murad became more than a man. He became a martyr, a symbol of sacrifice. His warriors did not waver. They fought with a fury that burned brighter with each passing moment. By the end of the day, the fields of Kosovo were silent. The banners of Serbia lay trampled, the knights fallen, and the shadow of the crescent stretched across the land. But for the Ottomans, the victory was bittersweet. They had won, but at a price. The shadow of Kosovo would linger, a memory of blood and sacrifice, the shadow of empire. But as the mist of Kosovo lifted, the Ottomans did not falter. A new sultan rose, Bayezid, son of Murad, fierce and swift like a thunderbolt. The empire did not pause to mourn. It marched on, its shadow spreading across the mountains and valleys of the Balkans. But with each victory, new enemies arose. The kings of Europe whispered of vengeance, of holy crusades, of driving back the shadow of the crescent. Alliances were forged in candlelit halls, oaths sworn by men who spoke of faith but thought of power. The seas stirred with the sails of distant fleets, and the forests whispered of hidden armies, waiting, watching. Within the empire, the Janissaries grew in strength, their white tunics a symbol of loyalty, but also of fear. For they were not just soldiers, they were a force bound to the Sultan alone, their loyalty unwavering, their blades sharp. And in the quiet corridors of the palaces, whispers grew, whispers of betrayal, of ambition. The shadow of the crescent was not just a shadow over lands, but over the hearts of men. But beneath that shadow, the Ottomans were not just conquerors, they were builders. Cities rose, roads stretched, markets thrived. The silver crescent flew above the minarets, and beneath its light, people lived, traded, and prayed. The Ottomans were not just a storm, they were a sky, vast and ever-reaching, and as the moon rose above the mountains, its silver light bathing the fields of Europe, the world knew that the Ottoman Empire was not just a tale of warriors and battles. It was a dream that had become a shadow that stretched across mountains, rivers, and seas. Chapter 4. The Thunder of Constantinople. Beneath the vast pale sky, a city shimmered like a dream. Its walls rose tall and proud, their ancient stones kissed by the light of dawn. Minarets and domes crowned the skyline, their gold-tipped spires piercing the heavens. This was Constantinople, the queen of cities, a place where East met West, where empires clashed and faiths intertwined. For centuries, Constantinople had stood unyielding, a jewel of Byzantium, a city whose name whispered of power and glory. Its walls, the Theodosian walls, were said to be unbreakable, a triple layer of stone and iron that had turned away countless invaders. Ships sailed through the Golden Horn, their sails glinting beneath the sun, while merchants from distant lands crowded its markets, their voices a tapestry of tongues. But for the Ottomans, Constantinople was more than just a city. It was a dream that shimmered on the horizon, a promise of greatness that called to them like a distant star. Sultans had gazed upon its walls, their hearts stirred by the thought of claiming it. Yet the city stood defiant, its gates closed, its towers watching like silent guardians. Inside those walls, life was a blend of faith and fortune. Bells rang from grand churches, their hymns rising to the sky. Scholars debated in marble halls, their words echoing beneath painted domes. Traders filled the markets, their spices and silks a kaleidoscope of color. But beneath the grandeur, shadows whispered. The once mighty Byzantine Empire had withered, its lands lost, its armies scattered. Constantinople was a jewel, but a fading one, its luster dimmed by years of decline, yet it was not forgotten. For the Ottomans, it was a promise, a city that stood like a challenge, a fortress that whispered of glory. And in the quiet plains beyond its walls, a young man gazed upon it with a quiet fire in his eyes. His name was Mehmed, and in his heart the dream of Constantinople was not just a distant hope, it was a destiny. The rise of Mehmed night sky stretched wide, a velvet blanket scattered with silver stars. Beneath this sky, a young boy stood alone, his gaze fixed upon the distant lights of Constantinople. His name was Mehmed, son of Murad II, a boy of sharp mind and restless spirit. Even in his youth, there was a fierce light in his eyes, a hunger that burned like a quiet flame. Mehmed grew up in a world of whispers of empires that rose and fell, of sultans who dreamed and died. But among these whispers, one name shone like a beacon: Constantinople. His tutors spoke of it with awe, his father with longing. But to Mehmed, it was not just a story. It was a promise, a challenge. From the moment he could hold a sword, Mehmed was trained not just as a prince, but as a warrior. He studied the art of war, the wisdom of the ancients, the secrets of siegecraft. He learned of great conquerors, Alexander, Caesar, and his own forefathers. But for Mehmed, they were not just heroes, they were shadows. Shadows that urged him forward, that whispered of a greatness yet to be won. When his father, Sultan Murad II, died, Mehmed ascended the throne. He was young, barely a man, but his heart was fierce. Around him, whispers grew. Some called him a child, a boy too young to rule. But Mehmed did not waver. Beneath his calm gaze was a storm, a determination that would not bend, and in that storm, one dream burned brighter than all Constantinople. Mehmed's gaze turned to the city that had defied empires, that had turned away armies, that stood like a silent challenge. For him, it was not just a prize, it was a destiny. And he would not rest until its towers bore the crescent of the Ottomans. The siege of Constantinople. The air was thick with the scent of burning pitch, the sky dark with smoke. Beneath the shadow of the Theodosian walls, a sea of warriors stretched, their banners fluttering in the cold wind. Mehmed's army, a host of thousands, warriors from distant lands, bound by one dream. The cannons spoke first great bronze, monsters that roared like thunder. Their iron balls crashed against the ancient walls, sending clouds of dust and stone into the air. But the walls stood, scarred but unbroken. Day after day, the cannons roared, their thunder rolling across the plains, a chorus of iron and fire. But Constantinople was not just a city of walls. It was a fortress of faith. Its people prayed beneath the great dome of Hagia Sophia, there, hymns rising like a quiet defiance. The city's defenders fought with fierce resolve, their arrows darkening the sky, their swords shining beneath the pale light, yet Mehmed did not waver. His cannons roared, his warriors surged, and his mind turned with plans. The Golden Horn, a narrow sea inlet that shielded the city, was chained a barrier that seemed unbreakable. But Mehmed saw not a barrier, but a challenge. His ships were dragged across the land, their wooden hulls pulled by the strength of men and oxen. They slipped into the waters beyond the chain, a silent fleet that struck like a thunderbolt. The city shuddered. Its walls trembled, its towers smoked. The defenders fought with desperate courage, but the shadow of the crescent grew. And on May 29, 1453, the walls broke. Mehmed's warriors surged through the shattered gates, their swords a tide of steel. The bells of Hagia Sophia fell silent, replaced by the echo of prayers. A new faith rising beneath its great dome, Mehmed entered the city, not as a mere conqueror, but as a man who had touched his dream. Constantinople was no longer a fading jewel. It was his, but it was not destroyed. Its churches stood, its markets thrived, its people lived. Beneath the crescent, it was reborn. The city of two worlds, Constantinople, was no more. In its place stood Istanbul, a city reborn, a bridge between two worlds, a heart that beat with the pulse of an empire. The streets buzzed with life, merchants from far lands filled the bazaars, their voices a blend of tongues and cultures. Ships filled the harbors, their sails bright against the blue waters, bringing spices, silks, and stories. But Istanbul was not just a city of trade. It was a city of faith. The great dome of Hagia Sophia, once a cathedral, now echoed with the call to prayer. Minarets rose beside it, their shadows stretching across the bustling streets. The light of the setting sun bathed the city in gold. Its towers aglow, its waters shimmering, Mehmed walked its streets, no longer just a conqueror, but a builder. Mosques rose beside churches, fountains sparkled in quiet squares, and the people lived beneath a sky where the crescent shone. Scholars were invited, their wisdom treasured. Poets wrote of the city's beauty, its streets a canvas of stories, but beneath the beauty, shadows lingered. The memory of the siege, the echoes of cannon fire, the whispers of those who had fallen. Yet the city lived, its heart beating with a rhythm that echoed across mountains and seas. Istanbul was not just a city of the Ottomans, it was a city of the world, and Mehmed, now known as Mem the Conqueror, gazed upon the city he had claimed, his dream made real. But he did not rest, for in his heart the dream of empire did not end with these walls. It was a dream that stretched to distant lands, that whispered of mountains and rivers, of kingdoms yet to bow. Istanbul was his jewel, but the world was his horizon. And beneath the shadow of its minarets, the crescent moon rose, a symbol of a dream that would not fade. Chapter 5. The Golden Age of Suleiman. The first light of dawn touched the waters of the Bosphorus, a soft glow that painted the domes of Istanbul in hues of rose and gold. Beneath the rising sun, the city-stirred merchants opened their stalls. Sailors unfurled their sails, and the call to prayer echoed gently from the minarets. Yet beyond this waking city, beyond the whisper of the breeze over the blue waters, a figure stood in quiet thought. This was Suleiman, a name that would echo across the ages, a sultan whose rule would be remembered as a golden age. But in this moment, he was just a man, young, thoughtful, and yet to be tested. The son of Selim, the grim Suleiman inherited an empire of vast lands, stretching from the deserts of Arabia to the mountains of Anatolia, from the shores of the Mediterranean to the plains of Hungary. But to him, it was not enough. He was not just a sultan, he was a dreamer. In his youth, Suleiman had studied poetry and law, history and philosophy. He was a warrior, but also a poet. He believed that an empire was not just a land of swords and soldiers, it was a land of justice, of beauty, of wisdom. And beneath his calm gaze, beneath his measured words, burned a quiet fire, a desire to make the Ottoman Empire a beacon, not just of power, but of greatness. The world would come to know him as Suleiman the Magnificent, a title earned not just by his victories, but by his vision. His armies would march across distant lands, his fleet would rule the seas, and his laws would shape the lives of millions. He would stand beneath the great dome of Hagia Sophia, his prayers rising like whispered poetry. He would walk through the marble halls of Topkapi Palace, his voice a quiet command that would change the fate of empires. But greatness was not just built with swords or crowns. It was built with wisdom, with patience, and with justice. And for Suleiman, true greatness began not in the roar of battle, but in the quiet moments, the moments where dreams were born, and a sultan stood beneath the rising sun, his heart filled with the promise of a golden age, the laws of the sultanan, the quiet chambers of Topkapi Palace. The sunlight filtered through stained glass, painting the marble floors in hues of sapphire and emerald. Here, in the heart of his empire, Suleiman did not just rule with a sword, he ruled with a pen. And the ink he used would not simply stain paper, it would shape lives. These were the Qanon, the laws of Suleiman, a series of rules that would bring order to an empire of many lands, many faiths, and many peoples. They were not just edicts, whispered in palace halls. They were a promise of justice, a foundation of order. Suleiman understood that power was not just the strength of armies or the wealth of treasuries. True power was justice, a justice that touched the lives of the farmer in the fields, the merchant in the bazaar, the soldier on the frontier. And so he called his scholars, his judges, his wise men, and together they crafted the Qanon. These laws were not just echoes of ancient traditions, nor were they simply the commands of a king. They were a blend, a harmony between the teachings of Islam and the needs of a vast, diverse state. Taxes were defined, but fairness was demanded. Land was granted, but rights were protected. The judges were empowered, but the poor were shielded from. The marble courts of Istanbul to the quiet villages of Anatolia, the Khanan reached. The merchant in Cairo knew his trade was protected. The farmer in Syria knew his harvest was his own. And in the courts, the judges spoke not with the whim of tyranny, but with the wisdom of law. But these laws were not just cold words on parchment. They were a reflection of Suleiman himself, a man who believed that justice was the soul of an empire. A sultan who saw his people not as subjects, but as souls entrusted to his care. The gates of Vienna air was cold, the sky gray with the promise of rain. Beneath the dark clouds, a sea of banners stretched across the fields, banners of green, of gold, of crimson. Beneath these banners stood an army, the army of Suleiman, an ocean of warriors whose armor glinted beneath the pale light, whose eyes were sharp, whose hands held swords that had seen 1,000 battles. This was not just any army, it was the might of the Ottoman Empire, a host that had marched across mountains and rivers, that had crossed deserts and seas. And now it stood before the walls of Vienna, a city that rose like a silent challenge, its spires piercing the sky, its walls thick with defenders. The cannons thundered, their roar a voice of iron that shook the earth. The janissaries marched, their white tunics a sea of resolve. The banners of the crescent rippled in the cold wind, a promise of faith, a symbol of power. And above them all, in a grand tent of green and gold, sat Suleiman, his gaze calm, his heart steady. But Vienna was not like the cities of the East. Its walls were thick, its defenders fierce. Rain turned the fields to mud, sickness crept through the camps, and the cannons fell silent beneath the weight of the storm. Days became weeks, and the walls stood. Suleiman watched with quiet patience. He had led his armies far, but here, before the walls of Vienna, the storm was not just of rain, but of fate. In the end, the city did not fall. The walls held, and the armies of Suleiman withdrew, their banners rippling beneath the gray sky, but the shadow of the crescent did not fade. For Europe, the sight of the Ottoman banners before Vienna was a whisper of fear, a reminder that the dream of Suleiman was not just a distant tale, it was a shadow that stretched across mountains and rivers, a whisper that would never be forgotten, a legacy of gold and shadow. Suleiman returned to Istanbul, the city that sparkled like a jewel, beneath the light of the setting sun. The streets bustled with life, merchants shouted their wares, and the great domes of mosques rose like mountains of marble. The call to prayer echoed over the waters, a gentle chorus that filled the air, but beneath the splendor, shadows stirred. Suleiman's empire was vast, but with greatness came danger. Ambition whispered in quiet halls, loyalty was tested beneath the weight of gold. His court was filled with whispers of rivals, of plots, of those who spoke with silver tongues. But held iron hearts, Suleiman was not blind. He saw the whispers, the rivalries, the shadows that danced beneath the light of his reign. His sons were not just heirs, they were rivals. His trusted viziers were not just servants, they were players in a game of power. The golden halls of Topkapi shone, but beneath their marble floors, secrets twisted like roots in the dark, and yet Suleiman remained a figure of wisdom and strength. His armies still marched, his laws still guided, his cities still thrived. The world knew him as Suleiman the Magnificent, a sultan whose reign was a golden age. But even a golden age cast shadows as the sun set over Istanbul, its light painting the waters in hues of amber. Suleiman stood alone in his garden. He looked out over his city, his empire, a world shaped by his hand. But beneath the beauty, he saw the shadows that whispered of pride, of ambition, of a greatness that was as fragile as it was grand. And in that quiet moment, beneath the fading light of the golden sky, Suleiman the Magnificent stood as both a conqueror and a dreamer, a man whose empire reached for the stars, but whose shadow stretched across the earth. Chapter 6. The poisoned throne, the palace of Topkapi, stood beneath the clear blue sky, its domes shimmering in the golden light of dawn. But within its grand halls, beneath its marble floors and painted ceilings, shadows moved. For Topkapi was more than just a palace. It was a world of secrets, a maze of corridors where whispers were more dangerous than swords. And at the heart of this world was the harem, a place of silken veils and whispered prayers, of jeweled robes and quiet laughter. But beneath its beauty lay a quiet storm. For this was not just a place of leisure, it was a battlefield, where ambition wore a gentle smile and alliances were made with a glance. The women of the harem were not just companions, they were players in a game where the stakes were crowns and kingdoms. Here, the sultan's favorites walked with quiet grace, their faces serene, but their hearts wary. Beneath the glow of lanterns, they whispered of promises and betrayals, of sons who might become sultans, of rivals who must be outmaneuvered. For in the harem, a mother's love was a weapon, and a whispered rumor could become a blade dot in the quiet gardens, where fountains murmured and birds sang. The sultan's sons played innocent, unaware of the shadows that danced around them. But each boy was more than just a child. He was a seed of power, a promise that could one day bloom or wither, depending on the whispers of the harem. The sultan himself walked these gardens, his gaze calm, his voice gentle. But he too was part of this game, a king whose heart could be swayed, whose ears could be filled with honeyed words. And around him the women danced, their smiles soft, their words sweet, but their eyes sharp. The harem was a world of beauty, but also a world of shadows. A world where the soft rustle of silk could be a warning, where the perfume of roses could mask the scent of poison. It was a place where the fate of an empire was whispered, not shouted, a place where power wore a gentle face, the age of fratricide. But beneath the silken whispers of the harem lay a darker truth, a truth painted in blood. For in the Ottoman Empire, power was not just a gift, it was a prize, won and defended with iron and fear. And for those who sought the throne, there was a price paid in the blood of brothers. This was the age of fratricide, a tradition born of fear, a law carved not on parchment, but in the hearts of sultans. For in an empire where brothers were both family and rivals, survival meant eliminating any threat, even if that threat shared your own blood. The halls of Topkapi whispered of tears and shadows. The sultan's sons were not just heirs, they were rivals, each a spark that could become a flame. And when a new sultan rose to the throne, that spark became a danger. Brothers were not simply banished, they were silenced, their young lives snuffed out in the quiet shadows of the palace dot. It did not matter that they were children, boys with wide eyes and gentle smiles. It did not matter that they laughed beneath the shade of the garden trees or whispered prayers at night. What mattered was the throne, the crown, the survival of the sultan's line. The sultans did not wield the blade themselves. That task fell to the mute executioner's men who spoke no words, who left no whispers behind. Their silken cords were swift, their hands steady, their faces calm. For them, this was not cruelty, it was duty, but the walls of Topkapi remembered. The marble floors knew the quiet steps of fear. The gardens held the shadows of young lives lost. And beneath the grandeur of the Ottoman court, beneath the splendor of its golden halls, a quiet sadness whispered, a sadness painted in the blood of brothers, the rise of the Janissaries beyond, the silken shadows of the harem beyond the quiet. Halls of the palace, another force grew, a force born not of whispers, but of iron. These were the Janissaries, the elite warriors of the Ottoman Empire, once the loyal sword of the Sultan. But as the years passed, they became something more, a power unto themselves. The Janissaries were not just soldiers. They were a brotherhood, a force bound not by blood, but by loyalty to the cause, to their banners, to their traditions. Clad in white tunics, their faces calm, their blades sharp, they were the iron heart of the empire. They had once been boys taken from distant lands, Christian children brought to the heart of the empire, raised in the shadow of the crescent, trained to fight, to pray, to serve. But those boys had grown into men, men who marched in perfect ranks, who stood like a wall of steel, whose loyalty was once to the Sultan alone. But loyalty is a flame that can be fed or starved. The sultans, caught in the shadows of the harem, whispered to by rivals, dazzled by luxury, began to take the Janissaries for granted. They saw them not as brothers, but as tools to be used, to be ordered, to be cast aside. But the Janissaries were not shadows. They were iron. And when they felt their honor threatened, when they saw that their loyalty was met with contempt, they did not remain silent. They spoke with steel. Rebellion sparked, not in the shadows, but in the open squares of Istanbul. The Janissaries, once the shield of the Sultan, became a force that could shatter his throne. Their white tunics were stained with the blood of rivals. Their silent march became a roar. They had become a state within a state, a shadow that the sultans could no longer ignore. The cost of power, domes of Topkapi Palace shone beneath the setting sun, their golden glow reflected in the waters of the Bosphorus. The call to prayer rose like a gentle song, a reminder of faith, of peace. But beneath the tranquil beauty, the heart of the empire ached. For power is a jewel, but a jewel that can crack. The Ottoman Empire was vast, its lands stretching across mountains, deserts, and seas. Its markets overflowed with silks and spices. Its mosques shimmered like jewels beneath the sun. But beneath the splendor, shadows grew. Corruption whispered in the quiet halls of the palace. Viziers exchanged favors like coins. Merchants grew rich on false promises, and justice was bought with gold. The sultans, once warriors and dreamers, became shadows of their forefathers, men caught in the web of the harem, distracted by the pleasures of the court. The Janissaries, once the sword of the empire, became a beast that fed on fear, a force that could make or break a sultan. Their loyalty was not to the throne, but to their own power. They marched in the streets, their voices a roar that echoed beneath the marble domes. The people murmured of taxes that grew heavier, of justice that grew distant. Farmers left their fields, soldiers grew weary, and the streets whispered of rebellion. The empire was not just a land of glory, it was a land of shadows, and yet the empire did not fall. The minarets still touched the sky, the bazaars still bustled with life. The ships still sailed beneath the crescent flag. But beneath the beauty, the cracks grew. Beneath the whispers of the harem, beneath the iron of the janissaries, beneath the splendor of the court, a quiet rot spread. The Ottoman Empire was still a jewel that shone beneath the light of the sun. But it was a jewel with shadows, a jewel whose beauty hid the quiet cost of power, and as the sun set over Istanbul, its light fading into the gentle embrace of night, the empire stood a dream that shone, but also a shadow that whispered. Chapter 7. The Sick Man of Europe. The sun rose over the waters of the Bosphorus, its pale light spilling across the city of Istanbul. The minarets still rose like silver spears against the sky. The domes of great mosques shimmered with a soft glow, and the call to prayer echoed gently over the bustling streets. But beneath this tranquil beauty, the Ottoman Empire was changing. Once a force that had shaken the world, it now stood like an old man leaning on a crumbling wall, proud but weary. Europe had a name for this ancient empire, the Sick Man of Europe. It was a title whispered in the candlelit halls of London, Paris, and Vienna. For the great powers of Europe, the Ottoman Empire was no longer a fearsome conqueror. It was a fading relic, a treasure chest waiting to be opened. And the hungry eyes of Britain, France, and Russia looked upon its lands with quiet greed. The empire stretched across 3 continents, its lands a tapestry of mountains, deserts, and seas. But the vastness that had once been its strength was now its burden. From the frozen forests of the Caucasus to the burning sands of Arabia, rebellion stirred. Local lords grew defiant, distant provinces whispered of independence, and old rivalries simmered beneath the surface. The mighty armies of the Ottomans, once an unstoppable force, had grown thin and weary. The janissaries, once the iron heart of the empire, had become a memory replaced by soldiers who fought not with faith, but for coin. The great fleets that had once ruled the Mediterranean now lay anchored, their sails torn, their decks quiet, and yet in the heart of Istanbul. The sultans still walked the marble halls of Topkapi Palace. They still wore crowns of gold. They still signed decrees with a flourish. But their power was a shadow, a distant echo of the glory that had once been. For while the city still shone like a jewel, the empire beneath it trembled, its foundations cracked, its spirit weary. But the world did not look upon the sick man with pity. It looked with hunger. For in the fading light of Ottoman power, Europe saw an opportunity, a chance to carve, to conquer, to claim the Tanzimat reforms. But the Ottoman Empire was not yet a corpse, and its rulers were not yet willing to surrender to the whispers of Europe. In the grand halls of Istanbul, beneath the painted ceilings and gilded chandeliers, a new hope was born, a hope whispered in the word Tanzimat. The Tanzimat reforms were a final, desperate attempt to breathe life into the fading empire. A promise of change, of strength, of a future where the sick man might stand tall once more. The reforms were not just words on parchment, they were a dream of modernity. The empire would no longer be a patchwork of provinces ruled by distant lords. It would be a nation with laws that stretched from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Arabia. Taxes were standardized, schools were opened, and the military was reshaped. The old feudal system gave way to a central authority, and the people were promised justice beneath the shadow of the crescent. Freedom of religion was declared, a promise that echoed beneath the domes of mosques and the arches of churches. Christians, Jews, and Muslims were told they would stand as equals beneath the law. New schools were built, young minds were filled with knowledge of science, of literature, of the world beyond the empire's shores, but dreams are fragile things. For while the Tanzimat reforms promised change, they also stirred resistance. The old lords, the pashas and beys who had grown fat on privilege, saw their power threatened. The soldiers raised in the shadow of tradition grumbled at the new uniforms, the new rules. And in the quiet corners of the palace, whispers grew whispers of betrayal, of treachery, of those who saw and changed not hope, but danger. The Tanzimat was a dream, but a dream caught between the ancient shadows of the past and the bright, blinding light of the future. And even as the empire tried to stand tall, its legs trembled beneath the weight of centuries. The Eastern question, but the true danger to the Ottoman Empire, did not rise from within its borders, it came from beyond. In the candlelit chambers of Europe's palaces, kings and ministers whispered of the Eastern question. They did not ask if the Ottoman Empire would fall, they asked when and who would take its place. Russia looked south, its eyes fixed on the Black Sea, its armies waiting to march through the Caucasus, its ships prowling the waters of the Bosphorus. To the Tsars, the Ottoman Empire was a gate to the warm waters they had always desired. Britain, with its mighty navy, saw the Ottoman lands as a shield, a barrier that kept Russian ambition at bay, that protected the sea routes to India, the jewel of the British crown. To London, the sick man could not be allowed to die, but neither could he be allowed to grow strong. France, proud and eager for glory, saw the chance to protect the Christians of the Levant, to carve out a sphere of influence, to play the game of power beneath the banner of faith. And Austria watched with quiet dread, for the fall of the Ottoman Empire would mean chaos on its southern border. Diplomacy became a battlefield, a quiet war of letters and treaties, of threats whispered beneath the calm surface of polite words. The great powers met, they spoke of peace, they wrote of protection, but in their hearts they saw only opportunity, and the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, stood at the center of this game, a prize to be claimed, a shadow to be stretched, a dream to be whispered. The sultans struggling the quiet halls of Yild's palace, Sultan Abdul Hamid II, walked alone. The light of the setting sun painted the marble floors in hues of amber. The gardens beyond shimmered in the gentle breeze. But for the Sultan, the beauty of the palace was a distant dream. For he was not just a king, he was a man caught in a storm. Abdul Hamid II was no stranger to whispers. He had grown up in the shadow of the palace, had seen the shadows of the harem, had felt the weight of the crown. And now, as Sultan, he stood not as a conqueror, but as a guardian of an empire that seemed to crumble beneath his feet. He saw the hunger in the eyes of Europe, the quiet threats of Russia, the false smiles of Britain and France. He saw the rebellion stir in the distant provinces, the whispers of independence, the cries of those who spoke of freedom. But Abdul Hamid was not weak. He was a man of iron will, a sultan who knew that survival meant strength. He turned away from the dreams of the Tanzimat, from the promises of change, and wrapped himself in the shadows of power. Censorship silenced the voices of dissent. Spies whispered in the streets, and the walls of the palace grew thick with secrets. He was called the Red Sultan, a tyrant, a shadow. But he saw himself not as a monster, but as a shield against the chaos that threatened to devour his empire. He spoke of faith, of unity, of a world where the Ottoman Empire still stood tall beneath the crescent, but even the strongest shield can crack. Beneath the weight of war, of rebellion, of treachery, the empire trembled. And Abdul Hamid, the last great sultan, stood alone in his palace, a man whose dreams of strength were caught in the quiet storm of a dying world. The sun set over Istanbul, its light fading into the quiet darkness. And in the shadow of the minarets, the sick man of Europe stood a dream that whispered, a shadow that trembled, a star that faded into the gentle embrace of night. Chapter 8. The Fall of Constantinople again. The streets of Istanbul were quiet beneath the pale light of dawn. The call to prayer rose gently from the minarets, a familiar echo that wrapped the city in a soft embrace. But beneath this calm, a storm was brewing. A storm whispered in the quiet halls of schools, in the crowded corners of coffee houses, and in the restless hearts of the young. These were the Young Turks, a generation of students, officers and thinkers who looked upon the fading Ottoman Empire not with pride, but with sorrow. They saw an empire once mighty, now weak, its wealth plundered, its power whispered away. They saw sultans lost in the shadowed halls of Topkapi, while the world beyond their walls marched forward. But the Young Turks were not content with whispers. They spoke of freedom, of change, of a future where the empire would not bow to the whims of old men, but would rise beneath the light of reason. They spoke of constitutions, of rights, of a government that served the people, not just the throne. In the quiet city of Salonika, their whispers became a roar. Secret meetings turned to public marches. Pamphlets filled the streets, their words carried by the wind. The army, once a loyal tool of the Sultan, now stirred with new ideas. Young officers spoke of honor, of duty not to the Sultan, but to the nation, and in 1908 the storm broke. The Young Turks rose, their voices a chorus that echoed across the empire. Sultan Abdul Hamid II, the shadowed ruler who had held the empire in his iron grip, was forced to bend. A constitution was declared. A parliament opened. The dream of the Young Turks seemed to become a reality, but dreams are fragile. Even as the banners of freedom rose, old rivalries simmered beneath the surface. The empire was not just a land of Turks, it was a land of Arabs, of Armenians, of Greeks, of countless peoples whose dreams were their own. And beneath the shining light of reform, shadows whispered of divisions yet to come. The last sultan's palaces of Istanbul still shimmered beneath the warm light of the setting sun. The domes of mosques rose like silent guardians. The waters of the Bosphorus shimmered beneath the gentle breeze. But within the marble halls of Topkapi and Dolmabahce, the last sultans walked like shadows, rulers in name, but prisoners of fate. Sultan Mehmed V, a gentle man with a quiet smile, wore the crown, but not the power. He was a sultan who signed decrees he did not command, who spoke words that others whispered. The empire around him was not a land of strength, but a land caught between old dreams and new nightmares. Europe looked upon the Ottoman Empire with hunger. Its diplomats spoke of peace, but their eyes gleamed with quiet greed. The Balkans burned with the fires of rebellion. Old provinces slipped away, their banners replaced with the flags of new nations. The Sultan watched, but his hands were tied, his voice a whisper lost in the storm, and then came Mehmed V, the last sultan, a man who wore the crown not as a symbol of power, but as a shadow of shame. His throne was a prison, his court a hall of empty rituals. The streets of Istanbul whispered of change, of revolution, of a world where the Sultan was no more, but even as the empire crumbled, the city still shone. The bazaars still buzzed with life, the ships still sailed the blue waters, and the call to prayer still echoed from the minarets. The empire seemed alive, but it was a dream fading beneath the light of a new world, for the sultans were not rulers, they were shadows. Shadows of a greatness that had once been, shadows that watched as the world moved forward, leaving them behind. The great world burned beneath a sky of iron. The quiet fields of Europe became seas of mud, the mountains of the Caucasus whispered of death, and the deserts of Arabia shimmered with the mirage of war. This was the Great War, a storm that swept across nations, that shattered empires, that whispered of a world remade by fire. For the Ottoman Empire, the Great War was not just a battle, it was a final breath. The Sultan's ministers, desperate for power, looked to Germany, a new ally that promised strength, that whispered of victory. The Ottoman armies marched, proud banners flying, rifles gleaming beneath the pale light. But these were not the armies of old, not the iron warriors who had once shaken the world. They were tired men, caught between dreams and despair. The mountains of Gallipoli became a graveyard of hope. Allied ships filled the waters, their cannons thundered, their soldiers stormed the beaches. But the Ottomans, with a fierce resolve, held their ground. Young officers like Mustafa Kemal stood beneath the hail of bullets, their voices a beacon of courage. Gallipoli did not fall, but the victory was a shadow, a brief light in a world of darkness. In the deserts of Arabia, rebellion stirred. Lawrence of Arabia, a figure wrapped in robes and whispers, led Bedouin warriors against the Sultan's soldiers. Trains were ambushed, fortresses burned, and the red sands drank the blood of the fallen. The Arab revolt was not just a battle. It was a whisper of a world where the empire would no longer rule. The great cities of Baghdad, Jerusalem, and Damascus became battlegrounds. Ancient streets echoed with the thunder of guns. Minarets watched in silence as armies marched beneath their shadows. The empire's lands, once vast and proud, became a map of chaos, a map where borders shifted, where dreams crumbled, where history whispered of endings. And in the quiet halls of Istanbul, the Sultan watched a ruler who wore a crown, but who saw his world fade beneath the shadow of war. The final breath sun rose over Istanbul, its light soft, its warmth gentle. The call to prayer echoed from the minarets, a song of faith that whispered of peace. But for the Ottoman Empire, there was no peace. There was only the quiet whisper of an ending. The war was over, but the empire was shattered. Its lands were carved by foreign hands. Its people whispered of betrayal. Its cities filled with the shadows of foreign soldiers. Istanbul, the heart of the empire, lay beneath the shadow of foreign flags. But in this darkness, a voice rose, a voice that spoke not of sultans, but of a people, a voice that whispered not of empires, but of nations. His name was Mustafa Kemal, a man who had stood beneath the hail of bullets at Gallipoli, a man whose gaze was calm, whose voice was strong. Kemal did not speak of crowns, he spoke of freedom. He did not whisper of thrones, he spoke of a land that would stand not beneath the shadow of an empire, but beneath the light of a new dawn. He marched across Anatolia, his voice a call, his words a promise. The Sultan's palace still shimmered beneath the light of the setting sun, but it was a shell, an empty dream. The Sultan boarded a ship, his shadow slipping across the waters of the Bosphorus, a final figure of a world that had faded, and in its place, beneath the clear skies of Anatolia, a new dream rose, a dream called Turkey. A land not of sultans, but of people. A land that whispered of hope, of strength, of a future unchained from the shadows of the past. The Ottoman Empire was no more. But beneath the ruins of a dream, a new dream was born, a dream that rose like the first light of dawn, a dream that whispered not of endings, but of beginnings. Chapter 9. The Rise of the Young Turks. The streets of Istanbul stretched beneath the pale light of dawn, their cobblestones still wet with the mist of the morning. The soft hum of the city stirred, merchants setting up their stalls, fishermen calling out beside the Bosphorus, and the call to prayer rising like a gentle breeze. Yet beneath this familiar calm, a quiet restlessness grew, a whisper that spread from crowded coffee houses to quiet study rooms, from the docks to the shadowed corridors of barracks. This was the whisper of change, a whisper that danced on the lips of young men with sharp minds and restless hearts. Students in dark robes gathered beneath the arched windows of their schools, their eyes filled with the light of new ideas. They read of freedom, of rights, of nations where kings did not rule as tyrants but served as guardians of their people. They spoke of revolutions, of constitutions, of a world where the voice of the people was more than just a distant dream, but it was not just the students. Young officers, men whose swords gleamed beneath the morning sun, spoke of honor, but not just the honor of the battlefield. They spoke of the honor of a nation that served all its people, of an army that protected not just the throne, but the dreams of those who lived beneath its shadow. They were the Young Turks, a name that whispered of promise, of rebellion, of a future unchained from the shadows of old men. In the coffee houses, they whispered beneath the warm light of hanging lanterns, their words wrapped in the smoke of sweet tobacco. In the quiet barracks, they spoke of duty, not to a sultan lost in his palace, but to a nation waiting to be born, and with each whispered word, the dream grew, the dream of a land not ruled by fear, but by law, the dream of a government that did not serve itself, but its people, the dream of an empire that would not wither beneath the weight of old men's shadows, but would rise beneath the light of a new dawn. But dreams are fragile things, and beneath the light of hope, shadows always linger. The coo of 1908, the air was thick with the scent of rain, the sky a canvas of gray clouds that seemed to press down upon the city. Yet beneath this heavy sky, a storm far greater than the rain gathered. It began not with the roar of cannon, but with the quiet march of boots, the steady rhythm of young men who had grown tired of whispers. These were the officers of the Young Turks, men of iron will, of sharp minds, of restless hearts. They marched not as rebels, but as dreamers. Their banners fluttered in the cold wind, their faces calm, their eyes fierce. And at their head stood men like Enver Pasha and Niyazi Bey, leaders who spoke not of fear, but of freedom. Their march was not a battle, it was a demand that the Sultan, Abdul Hamid II, abandon the shadowed halls of despotism, that he allow the light of a constitution to shine once more. For too long, the empire had been ruled by decrees whispered in the darkness, by a court that seemed more a prison than a palace. The streets of Istanbul stirred with unease. The people watched, their eyes wide, their whispers quiet. Some spoke of hope, of a new dawn. Others spoke of fear, of chaos, of a world that trembled on the edge of a storm, and within the grand halls of Yild's palace, Sultan Abdul Hamid II stood beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers, his face a mask of calm. But even as he listened to the demands of the Young Turks, even as he signed the document that would restore the Constitution, his eyes remained sharp. For he knew that shadows could hide in the light, that those who spoke of freedom could also speak of ambition. The Young Turks rejoiced. The Constitution was restored, a parliament was called, and the dream seemed to become a reality. But even in this moment of triumph, the shadows lingered, shadows that whispered of betrayal, of power, of dreams that could turn to dust, a broken. Promiseth Parliament met beneath the high arches of its grand chamber, its marble floors gleaming, its voices a chorus of hope. The Young Turks walked its halls with pride, their words filled with promises, promises of liberty, of justice, of a future where all would stand as equals beneath the shadow of the crescent. But promises are fragile things. Even as the speeches rose, even as the laws were written, cracks began to show. The Young Turks, once united by the dream of change, now whispered of ambition, of power. Factions formed, each voice seeking not just freedom, but control. The Constitution, once a banner of hope, became a weapon. Laws were written not to protect, but to punish. Voices that once spoke of liberty now whispered of censorship, of control. And those who had marched for freedom now stood as rulers, their dreams twisted by the weight of power, ethnic tensions, once hidden beneath the shadow of a fading empire, now rose like a storm. Armenians, Greeks, Arabs, they spoke of their own dreams, their own futures. But for the Young Turks, these dreams were not a promise, they were a threat. Whispers of equality became cries of suspicion. Promises of unity became shadows of repression. The dream of a free empire became a prison of fear. The Young Turks, who had spoken of a light that would banish darkness, now walked in shadows of their own making, and beneath the quiet marble of the parliament, the dream of freedom withered. Its light dimmed by the quiet storm of ambition, the Balkan nightmare. But even as the Young Turks whispered of power, even as the parliament echoed with their voices, a storm gathered beyond the empire's borders, a storm that would not whisper, but roar. The Balkans, a land of mountains and rivers, of proud kingdoms and ancient hatreds, became a battlefield. Macedonia, Albania, Thrace, lands where the Ottoman banners had once flown, now echoed with the thunder of war. The Balkan Wars swept across these lands like a wildfire, a storm that devoured villages, that shattered cities, that whispered of empires that crumbled beneath the weight of history. Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, each nation rose, their flags bright against the dark sky, their armies marching beneath the call of freedom. But for the Ottoman Empire, this was not a call of freedom, it was a whisper of death. Fortresses crumbled, soldiers fell, and the old provinces of Europe slipped away like sand through open fingers. The Young Turks, who had spoken of strength, now watched as their dreams burned. The armies they had reformed broke beneath the weight of defeat. The lands they had promised to protect vanished beyond their reach. Istanbul stood, but it was no longer a city at the heart of an empire. It was a city at the edge of a fading dream, and beneath the pale light of dawn, the streets of Istanbul whispered of loss. Soldiers limped home, their eyes empty, their flags torn. Families wept for sons who would never return. The bazaars, once filled with the colors of many lands, now whispered of hunger, of fear The Balkan Wars were not just a battle. They were a whisper of an empire that had once reached across mountains and seas, but now stood like a shadow. Trembling beneath the weight of history, the young Turks had dreamed of freedom. But all that remained were shadows, shadows of promises, shadows of power, shadows of an empire that seemed to fade with each passing dawn. Chapter 10. The Great War's Shadow. The sky above Istanbul stretched wide and pale, a soft canvas touched by the first light of dawn. The city stirred with its quiet rhythm. The call to prayer rose gently from the minarets. Seagulls danced over the waters of the Bosphorus, and merchants prepared their stalls beneath the shadow of ancient domes. But beneath this calm, a storm gathered, a storm whispered across the seas, a storm called the Great War. Europe had become a furnace, a land where kingdoms clashed and empires bled. Germany's iron eagles soared above the battlefields of France, their soldiers marching beneath the steel-gray sky. Britain's fleets prowled the seas, their guns booming like thunder. Russia's vast armies surged across the eastern plains, their banners fluttering in the cold wind and caught in the shadow of this chaos stood the Ottoman Empire, a realm once proud, now weary, its heart still beating, but its limbs trembling. Its rulers saw the world divide, saw the great powers draw their swords, and in their fear they sought a lifeline. That lifeline came not as a friend, but as an alliance, a pact with Germany, a promise whispered in quiet halls, sealed with iron words for the Ottomans. This was not a dream of glory, it was a gamble for survival. The Sultan's ministers spoke of strength, of victory, but their eyes whispered of desperation. The empire had grown old, its armies thin, its ships silent in the harbors. But with Germany, there was a promise of weapons, of gold, of protection against the hunger of Russia, the ambition of Britain, and so the Ottomans marched to war not as conquerors, but as shadows. Their soldiers marched beneath the crescent moon, their rifles sharp, their eyes weary. From the deserts of Arabia to the mountains of the Caucasus they marched. But they marched not towards glory, but towards a storm that would not whisper, but roar. The Great War spread its shadow across mountains and seas, and the Ottoman Empire, once a land of calm minarets and bustling bazaars, became a battlefield, a land where dreams whispered and nightmares roared. The Gallipoli Stanley Sea stretched wide and gray beneath a sky of steel. The wind whispered over the waters, gentle but cold, and the waves danced with a quiet, rhythmic crash. But beneath this soft surface, shadows stirred, shadows of ships, their iron hulls cutting through the mist, their banners bright with the flags of distant lands. This was Gallipoli, a land of steep cliffs and quiet coves, a land that watched the waters of the Dardanelles with a quiet strength. But now, those cliffs whispered not of peace, but of war. For on these shores, the Allied forces had come, British, Australian, New Zealanders, and French, their ships filling the horizon, their soldiers packed beneath the pale sails, their cannons roared, their rifles cracked, and the cliffs of Gallipoli trembled. Yet upon those cliffs stood men who did not waver, the Ottoman soldiers, young and old, their uniforms a patchwork of gray and green, their rifles sharp, their eyes fierce. These were men who fought not for conquest, but for home. For beneath the shadow of the crescent, Gallipoli was not just a battlefield, it was a promise, a threshold that must not be crossed. The Allied soldiers landed beneath a rain of bullets, their boots sinking into the soft sand, their cries lost beneath the roar of cannon fire. But the Ottoman soldiers stood firm. From the trenches dug into the steep slopes, they fired with quiet determination. Their courage whispered in each shot. Their hope whispered in each breath. Among them stood a young officer named Mustafa Kemal. His voice was calm, his gaze steady. "I do not order you to attack," he told his weary men. "I order you to die. In the time it takes us to die, others will replace us," and they did. The Ottoman soldiers fell, but they did not falter. The cliffs of Gallipoli became a graveyard of dreams. The sea whispered of courage, the winds sang of loss. And when the final shots were fired, when the ships of the Allies turned away, the Ottoman flag still fluttered above the cliffs, but the victory was a shadow, a light that whispered of strength even as the darkness grew. For beneath the courage of Gallipoli, the empire still bled, its strength withering beneath the storm of war. The desert revolt beneath the burning sun of Arabia. The desert stretched like a sea of gold, silent, endless, a land where the wind whispered of ancient tribes and lost kingdoms. But in this silence, a new whisper stirred, a whisper of rebellion, of revolt. Lawrence of Arabia, a name that danced upon the sands, a figure wrapped in white robes, his face shadowed by a Kafiesh. He was not just a man, he was a promise, a voice that spoke of freedom, of a world where the tribes of Arabia would stand not beneath the shadow of the Ottoman Empire, but beneath the light of their own dreams. The Bedouins rode beneath the burning sky, their horses swift, their rifles sharp. They did not march as armies, but rode like whispers, their attacks like lightning, their shadows dancing upon the dunes. Ottoman garrisons, once proud beneath their banners, became silent ruins, their walls crumbling, their cannons cold. Trains became targets, their iron wheels torn from the tracks, their smoke twisting into the desert air. Fortresses that had watched. The quiet sands now echoed with the roar of battle, their gates shattered, their banners torn. The revolt was not just a battle, it was a whisper that became a storm. From the sands of Aqaba to the quiet hills of Damascus, the Bedouins rode, their voices a chorus of freedom. But freedom was not a promise, it was a shadow that whispered of power, of dreams that danced beneath the light, but whose roots twisted in the dark. The Ottoman Empire, which had once been a land of sultans and minarets, now trembled beneath the quiet whisper of the desert wind. The bitter and the streets of Istanbul shimmered beneath the pale light of dawn. The great mosques rose like silent mountains, their domes silver beneath the sky. But within the city, the whispers were not of prayer, but of hunger, of fear. Starvation gripped the land. The bazaars, once filled with spices and silks, now whispered of empty stalls, of bread that was too dear, of families who watched the sunset with empty hands. Disease crept through the crowded streets, a silent shadow that claimed young and old alike. In the shadowed halls of Topkapi, the Sultan walked like a ghost. The Great War had become a chain that wrapped around the empire, a storm that whispered of death. Provinces fell like leaves in the wind. Baghdad, Jerusalem, Damascus, names that had once whispered of glory now whispered of loss. The allied ships filled the waters of the Bosphorus, their guns silent but watchful. Foreign soldiers walked the streets of Istanbul, their boots echoing against the cobblestones. The Sultan, once a ruler whose word was law, became a prisoner in his own palace. His voice was a whisper, his crown a shadow. The empire was no longer a dream, it was a memory, a fading shadow stretched across mountains and seas. And even as the minarets touched the sky, Even as the call to prayer rose like a gentle song, the city knew that the empire was gone, but in the quiet streets of Anatolia, beneath the soft light of the rising sun, a new voice stirred. A voice that spoke not of sultans, but of freedom. A voice that whispered of a land called Turkey, a land that would rise not as a dream, but as a promise. The Ottoman Empire breathed its last beneath the shadow of foreign flags. But from its ashes, a new dawn whispered of hope. Chapter 11. The Last Sultan's Despair. Sultan Mehmed VI stood at the palace window, his weary eyes gazing out over the Bosphorus. The gray waters shimmered under the pale, clouded sky, but the view that once symbolized the strength of his empire now reflected only his helplessness. Constantinople, the jewel of the Ottoman Empire, was no longer his. Allied soldiers marched in orderly columns through the city's ancient streets, their boots echoing off the cobblestones. British flags fluttered on the wind, and French officers barked commands. Mehmed's heart ached with every step of those foreign troops, conquerors who now dictated his fate. Inside the palace, the grand halls that once celebrated the glory of the Ottoman sultans felt like gilded prisons. Every wall whispered of lost victories, of centuries when his ancestors commanded the world from these same marble corridors. But Mehmed was not a conqueror. He was a prisoner, a ruler without rule, a sultan without power. His ministers whispered behind closed doors, their faces pale with fear. They knew the truth. The Ottoman Empire, a realm that had once stretched from the deserts of Arabia to the gates of Vienna, was now a withered shadow. And Mehmed was the helpless witness to its fall. Beyond the palace walls, the city's people suffered under the crushing weight of foreign control. Once proud Ottoman soldiers were disarmed and humiliated. Turkish men and women walked in silence, their heads bowed beneath the gaze of occupying troops. Mosques that had once called the faithful to prayer now echoed with the heavy boots of European patrols. The call to prayer mingled with the sound of foreign voices, a haunting chorus of a city torn between its faith and its conquerors. Mehmed felt the weight of his ancestors pressing upon him, the ghostly presence of sultans who had ruled with iron fists, who had marched at the head of armies and brought empires to their knees. But he was not like them. His hands trembled as he clutched the silk curtain, his vision blurred with tears. He had become a prisoner in his own palace, a ruler whose commands were ignored, whose pleas fell upon deaf ears. The chains of defeat were not just in the streets, they were in his heart. The Treaty of Esfrespet, the chains of defeat, were soon forged into iron. In the grand halls of European diplomacy, the fate of the Ottoman Empire was sealed. The Treaty of Esfres was not just a document. It was a sentence, a map of a shattered world. Foreign powers descended like vultures upon the dying empire, carving it apart with lines drawn on maps and ink spilled on treaties. To the west, Greece seized Anatolia, its soldiers marching into Turkish villages, claiming land they had long coveted. Greek flags were raised where the Ottoman crescent had once flown. Farmers who had lived under the Sultan's protection for generations now found themselves strangers in their own homes. Fields that had fed the empire became battlefields, and Turkish families fled in fear. To the south, Italy claimed the warm shores of the Mediterranean, their warships anchoring in Ottoman harbors. Towns that had known only the crescent moon of Islam now saw the fluttering tricolor of Italy. The familiar songs of the muezzin were drowned out by the march of foreign troops, and Ottoman officers stood helplessly, stripped of their commands. In the east, France took Syria, marching into Damascus with a fanfare of trumpets and the crack of rifle salutes. The ancient cities of the Levant, cradles of history and faith, were torn from Ottoman hands. The Sultan's name, once spoken with reverence, became a whisper of the past, and within the palace itself, Mehmed VI received the news with hollow despair. The Treaty of Esfres was brought to him, its pages a cold list of betrayals. Advisers tried to explain, but their words were a blur. He signed the document with a trembling hand, knowing that with each stroke of the pen, another piece of his empire was lost. His signature became a symbol of his impotence, a reminder that he was no longer a ruler, but a captive in a gilded cage. The empire, which had once been the heart of the Muslim world, was now a patchwork of foreign colonies. The Ottoman banner was lowered, replaced by the flags of conquerors. And Mehmed's heart broke a little more with each fallen star on that ancient flag, the birth of Resistancia even in the darkness. A spark of defiance remained. In the rugged mountains of Anatolia, where the cold winds swept across the plains, a figure emerged, a man who refused to bow, who refused to surrender. Mustafa Kemal, a general who had fought with the Ottoman army, now saw only one path, resistance. Kemal's voice was a call to arms, a whisper that grew into a storm. He gathered the broken remnants of Ottoman soldiers, men who had lost everything but their honor. Farmers joined his ranks, their scythes replaced with rifles. Towns that had once wept under foreign occupation now whispered his name in secret. Atat Rike, they would one day call him father of the Turks. In the city of Ankara, a new capital rose, a place of defiance, a bastion of hope. Here, the Turkish national movement was born, a force that would defy the victors of the Great War. Kemal's voice became a banner, his courage a shield. He spoke of freedom, of a new nation that would rise from the ashes of the old, but this was not just a war for land. It was a war for dignity, for survival, for the soul of a people who had been cast aside by history. Kemal's soldiers marched with iron determination, their rifles old, their uniforms tattered, but their spirits unbroken. In village squares and mountain passes, they fought not as conquerors, but as sons of a land they refused to lose. The world watched with a mixture of shock and admiration. What had seemed like the end of the Ottoman story became the birth of a new chapter. And as the fires of war spread, even the Sultan heard whispers of this defiant general, this man who dared to fight when all seemed lost, the flight of the Sultan. But for Sultan Mehmed VI, there would be no redemption. As the fires of resistance burned brighter in Anatolia, his world grew darker. The allied powers who once treated him as a useful puppet now saw him as an inconvenience. His once grand palace became a lonely prison, each hall echoing with the silence of abandonment. In the early hours of a cold, mist-shrouded morning, Mehmed was told he must leave. The Sultan, the last shadow of a dynasty that had ruled for 600 years, was cast aside like an unwanted relic. His servants wept as they packed his belongings, but their tears did not stop the inevitable. A British warship waited at the dock, its iron hull looming like a silent specter. Mehmed stepped aboard, his gaze lingering on the city's skyline, the minarets of Hagia Sophia, the domes of the Blue Mosque, the winding streets of Constantinople. This was his city, his empire. And now it was gone. As the ship's engines rumbled to life, the Sultan stood alone on the deck, the cold sea wind biting at his face. He was no longer the ruler of an empire. He was an exile, a forgotten figure adrift on the tides of history, and as the ship sailed into the mist, the Ottoman dynasty, once the terror of Europe, the guardian of Mecca, the jewel of Islam, faded into memory. The age of sultans had ended, and with it, so too ended the story of Mehmed VI, the last sultan of the Ottoman Empire. Chapter 12. The Dawn of a New Turkey. Anatolia was a land scarred by war. Smoke curled over the mountains, rising from villages reduced to ash. Fields once golden with grain were trampled under the boots of marching armies. The Greeks, bolstered by allied support, had marched inland, believing that their victory was certain. Towns fell beneath their advance, their soldiers waving blue and white flags under the pale sky. But beneath that sky, another force stirred, a force born of defiance, Mustafa Kemal, a man whose sharp gaze seemed to pierce the fog of despair, stood at the heart of this resistance. His voice carried over the winds, a call to arms for those who had nothing left but their pride. Farmers, shepherds, and blacksmiths laid down their tools and took up rifles. Mothers sent their sons to the front with prayers whispered against the cold. They did not fight for glory or conquest. They fought to survive, to keep the land of their ancestors from slipping away. In village squares, men gathered under makeshift banners. Old cannons, relics of a defeated empire, were dragged from forgotten forts. Women stitched uniforms, their hands trembling but determined. Boys, too young for war, watched with wide eyes as their fathers marched away, the dust of their footsteps lingering in the air. Each family gave something: a son, a horse, a handful of grain. The land itself seemed to rise in rebellion, its mountains hiding guerrilla fighters, its forests sheltering the weary. The Greeks pressed on, their columns winding through narrow valleys and across open plains. They came with the confidence of conquerors, their flags bright against the smoky sky. But the further they marched, the stronger the resistance became. Villages they had burned would rise again, their ruins filled with voices singing songs of defiance. Soldiers who had known only defeat now found courage in each other, in the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, who stood always at the front, unyielding. The war was a storm of fire and steel, a struggle of men who fought not for titles but for the earth beneath their feet. And though the villages burned and the fields were trampled, the spirit of Anatolia remained unbroken. The Battle of Sakarya was at the banks of the Sakarya River, that the fate of Anatolia would be decided. The land stretched wide, its fields barren and scarred from months of battle. The Greek army, confident in its strength, surged forward, determined to end this defiant rebellion once and for all. Their cannons thundered, their rifles flashed, and the air was thick with the acrid smoke of war. But Mustafa Kemal stood at the heart of his army, his eyes fixed on the horizon. His men were tired, their faces etched with the dust of the long march. But they were not broken. Behind them lay the heart of Anatolia, the towns and villages they had sworn to protect. And before them, the enemy loomed a force that threatened to erase their dream of freedom. Kemal's voice rose above the chaos, calm and resolute. There is no line of defense but the entire country, he declared. Not a step back. His words were more than a command. They were a promise that they would not surrender, that this would not be another defeat written in histories. Cruel pages, the battle raged for days. The sun rose over fields shrouded in smoke, and the moon cast its pale light on rivers stained red. Greek soldiers pressed forward, their bayonets glinting in the morning light. But the Turks did not falter. From behind rocks, from trenches carved into the earth, they fought with a fury born of desperation. Kemal moved among his men, his calm presence a beacon. Even when bullets tore the air around him, even when the ground shook with the roar of cannons, he did not flinch. His officers took courage from his gaze, his soldiers from his voice. He spoke not of glory, but of survival of a future that could be theirs if they held firm. The tide turned slowly. The Greek lines faltered, then broke. Their soldiers who had marched with such confidence now stumbled back, their cries lost beneath the thunder of retreat. Anatolia's defenders surged forward, their spirits unbroken, their land defended, and when the battle ended, it was the Turkish flag that rose above the field. The river of Sakarya, once a line of blood and smoke, now flowed calm beneath the pale sky. Mustafa Kemal's name was whispered with reverence, his defiance the spark that had kept the flame of hope alive. The Treaty of Lausanne victory, hard won and bitter, brought not just freedom but recognition. In the grand halls of Lausanne, where diplomats in dark suits whispered and argued beneath grand chandeliers, the fate of Anatolia was decided. But this time, the Turks were not silent. Mustafa Kemal's voice carried across the marble halls. His words a demand for dignity. The Treaty of Lausanne was signed in 1923, a document that redrew the map of the world. But unlike the cruel terms of the Treaty of Esfres, this was a treaty of survival. The foreign powers who had once carved Anatolia apart now recognized it as a sovereign nation. The Greek troops withdrew, their flags lowered. British and French soldiers boarded ships, their shadows fading from Turkish shores. Istanbul, the ancient city that had once trembled beneath the boots of conquerors, was Turkish once more. The Turkish Republic was born, not in the opulence of a sultan's palace, but in the fire of a struggle led by common men and women. A new flag rose, its crescent moon and star bright against the deep red, a symbol of a nation that had reclaimed its soul. Mustafa Kemal, the soldier who had become a leader, was now the voice of this new Turkey. But he spoke not of vengeance, not of empire. He spoke of a future built on education, on progress, on peace. His vision stretched beyond the fields of battle, beyond the ruins of war. It stretched to a future where his people could stand proud. Free from the chains of the past, the Republic of Turkey was not just a new nation. It was a promise that those who had fought and died would be remembered, that their struggle would not be forgotten, the end of the caliphate but one. Final shadow remained the shadow of the caliphate. For centuries, the Ottoman sultans had been not only rulers but caliphs, the spiritual leaders of the Muslim world. But this link to the past, this symbol of a fallen empire, now threatened the future. Mustafa Kemal knew that for Turkey to truly be free, it must sever this last chain. In 1924, the Grand National Assembly of Turkey made its decision. The caliphate was abolished, the final tie to the Ottoman past cut. The last caliph, Abdülmecid II, a figurehead in a palace stripped of power, was quietly sent into exile. No protests echoed through the streets. No armies rose to defend the title. The world watched in silence as this ancient institution faded into history. Mosques continued to call the faithful to prayer, but their call was a whisper of faith, not a command of power. Turkey stood as a secular nation, its gaze fixed forward. The minarets of Istanbul still reached for the sky, but they no longer cast the shadow of an empire, Mustafa Kemal, now known as Atatürk, father of the Turks, guided his people into a new age. Schools replaced palaces, factories rose where armies had once marched. A nation that had been born in fire now sought peace, and so ended the story of the Ottoman Empire, not in a grand battle, but in the quiet halls of a new republic. Its sultans were names in history, its army's memories in the dust. But from its ashes, a new Turkey had risen strong, free, and unbroken. Chapter 13. The Spirit of the Janissaries. They were not born as soldiers, nor were they born as Turks. They came as captives, children taken from the Christian villages of the Balkans, their young eyes wide with fear and wonder. They were the devshirme, the blood tax, a harvest of boys gathered by the Ottoman Empire. But what began as a burden would become a bond, a transformation forged in iron and discipline. These boys, stripped of their old names, faiths, and families, would be molded into something new, the Janissaries. Within the tall, silent walls of the barracks, the boys were given new names, new clothes, and new faith. They learned the prayers of Islam, their voices rising in soft whispers at dawn. But faith was only the beginning. The true lessons came with the sword, the bow, and the march. Day after day, they drilled beneath the gaze of stern officers. Their feet stamped in perfect unison, their arms swung like clockwork. Weakness was not tolerated. Pain was a teacher, and discipline was the creed. As they grew, the boys became young men, their bodies hardened by training, their minds sharpened by obedience. Brotherhood replaced fear. They were no longer captives, but warriors. They slept side by side, ate together, bled together. Each boy knew that he stood not just for himself, but for the regiment, a family bound by steel and loyalty. They were taught to fight with silent discipline, to march without question, and to kill without hesitation. Yet even as they became the Sultan's elite force, a strange pride grew within them. They were not mere soldiers, they were Janissaries, the iron heart of the Ottoman army. Their white caps marked them as the Sultan's chosen, their silver swords a symbol of his power. And in battle, they were unstoppable. Swift and silent, they struck like the wind, their muskets roaring like thunder. These were the children of war, molded from fear into iron. They had been taken as captives, but they became conquerors. And wherever the Sultan's banners flew, the Janissaries marched beneath them, a shadow of steel cast across the world. Masters of the battlefield, the world trembled beneath the march of the Janissaries. They were the Sultan's hammer, the iron fist that crushed all who stood before. The Ottoman Empire. From the mighty walls of Constantinople to the burning sands of Egypt, their reputation spread like wildfire. Clad in their white turbans and crimson cloaks, they were a sight to behold, a force that brought both terror and hope. When Sultan Mehmed too led his armies to the gates of Constantinople, it was the Janissaries who stood at the forefront. Their cannons roared, hurling iron against the ancient walls. When the final assault came, it was the Janissaries who surged forward, their swords flashing, their shields locked. They climbed the shattered walls, their battle cries echoing beneath the darkened sky. And when the city fell, It was they who stood triumphant beneath the shadow of the great Hagia Sophia. Their victories were not just in cities of stone. On the open fields of Europe, the Janissaries marched like thunderclouds. At the Battle of Mosees, they crushed the Hungarian forces, their muskets firing in perfect volleys, their swords cutting through the chaos. No fortress was too strong, no army too mighty. Where the Janissaries marched, the Sultan's will was done, yet they were more than just soldiers. They were a symbol of brotherhood that embodied the power of the Ottoman state. They were given privileges denied to other soldiers. They lived in grand barracks within the heart of the city, their red banners fluttering above the walls. They were paid in gold, their food prepared with the finest spices. In peacetime, they stood as the Sultan's personal guard, a wall of steel that surrounded his throne. But even as they won the Sultan's battles, a subtle change began to creep into their ranks. Pride grew into arrogance. Victory became a right, not a duty. The Janissaries, once the humble children of war, now walked with their heads high, their hands never far from their swords. The poison of power is a poison, and even the strongest can be corrupted by its touch. For the Janissaries, who had once stood as the Sultan's iron shield, that poison flowed slowly but surely. Their victories had brought them wealth, their loyalty had earned them privileges. But with each new honor, their discipline began to wither. They became not just soldiers, but kingmakers. In the grand halls of the palace, their commanders whispered. In the Sultan's ear, ambitious pashas courted their favor, knowing that the Janissaries held the true power of the empire. Sultans came and went, some crowned by the cheers of the Janissaries, others dragged from their thrones and cast aside at their command. The Sultan's iron guard had become a blade held at his own throat. The barracks of the Janissaries, once a place of discipline and brotherhood, now echoed with drunken laughter. Gold flowed freely, and the soldiers who had once trained in the fields now lounged in shaded courtyards, their hands heavy with jeweled rings. Corruption festered like a wound. Young men paid bribes to join their ranks, not for the honor of the sword, but for the wealth and privilege it brought. When war came, the once mighty Janissaries balked. They demanded higher wages, refused to march unless their demands were met. Battles were lost not for lack of courage, but for lack of will. And in the streets of Constantinople, the people whispered of the Janissaries not as heroes, but as tyrants. They were no longer the Sultan's shield. They were his burden, but power is a fire that consumes even those who wield it. And as the Janissaries grew fat with wealth and pride, the empire around them began to wither. The great Sultan Mahmud, too, was a patient man. He watched, year after year, as the Janissaries grew arrogant, their power overshadowing his own. He listened as they mocked his commands, threatened his throne. But in the quiet of his chamber, he planned. He knew that the poison could not be cured. It must be cut away. The plan was set in secret. On a warm summer night in 1826, the Sultan gave the signal. The great barracks of the Janissaries, where they had feasted and plotted, were surrounded. Cannons were drawn into the streets, their black muzzles aimed at the towering walls. A royal decree was issued. The Janissaries were to be disbanded, but the Janissaries did not surrender. They shouted in defiance, their swords flashing beneath the moonlight. Fires rose from their barracks, dark smoke curling into the night sky. The Sultan's troops, loyal and disciplined, moved like a tide of iron. The cannons roared, their thunder drowning out the cries of the dying. Street by street, room by room, the Janissaries were hunted, the once proud warriors who had marched. Beneath the Sultan's banner, now fled like hunted beasts. Some fell with swords in hand, others were burned alive in their own barracks. Those who survived were dragged to the Sultan's court, their pleas met with cold silence. By morning, the fires had died, and the streets were silent. The Janissaries were gone, their iron banners turned to ash, their name once spoken with. Fear and respect became a ghost whispered only in history. Sultan Mahmud II walked through the blackened ruins, his face calm. The great poison had been purged, but the price had been paid in blood. The spirit of the Janissaries, the children of war, the masters of the battlefield, the kingmakers, was gone, but their memory remained, a shadow that whispered of pride, of power, and of the fall that comes to those who forget humility. Chapter 14. The Harem's Secrets. Beyond the towering walls of Topkapi Palace, past the marble courtyards and golden domes, lay a world hidden from the eyes of the world, the harem. A palace within a palace. It was a place of silken curtains and shadowed corridors of jeweled mirrors and perfumed air. But beneath the soft glow of lantern light and the rustle of silk, this was a world built on power, ambition, and whispered secrets. The harem was not merely a place of beauty. It was a fortress guarded by eunuchs whose solemn faces concealed lives of quiet obedience. Tall iron doors kept the world out, and the sultans will kept the women within. But to call them prisoners would be a lie. For here, behind these veils, queens were made and kingdoms were guided. The sultan ruled an empire, but within these walls, another empire thrived, an empire of whispers. Women from distant lands were brought here, their fates decided by chance or choice. Some were daughters of foreign kings, gifted as tokens of alliance. Others were captives of war, their chains replaced by silks. They came from the deserts of Arabia, the mountains of the Caucasus, the vineyards of Greece. Each was a flower in the Sultan's garden, their beauty celebrated, their ambitions masked by smiles, but beauty was not their only weapon. In the shadows of the harem, lessons were whispered: how to dance with grace, how to sing sweetly, how to speak words that could melt a man's heart. But more than that, they learned the language of power. For each woman knew that beyond the laughter and music, beyond the soft glow of the lanterns, a silent battle raged. Each woman was a rival, each smile a mask, and at the heart of this, hidden world was the Sultan himself, a figure whose glance could turn a maid into a queen, whose touch could change a life forever. But even he was not truly free. For though he ruled the empire beyond these walls, the harem was a world where he was watched, whispered about, and sometimes deceived. The Sultan's shadow queens in this world of silk and shadow, some women, rose above the rest. They were the true power behind the throne, the whisperers who guided the Sultan's hand. Chief among them was the Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother. Her word was law within the harem, her influence reaching far beyond its gilded gates. She was more than a mother. She was an empress without a crown. Her wisdom and while shaping the empire itself, the Valide Sultan's chambers were a place of quiet authority, where gifts from foreign lands were brought in tribute, where ambassadors sought favor, and where even the Sultan listened. Her voice was a counsel, her frown a warning. In the soft light of her chamber, alliances were forged, and enemies were destroyed. Her servants moved like shadows. Her messengers carried whispers that could change fates. But she was not alone. Around her, a court of powerful women thrived, the Sultan's wives, his favorite concubines, his daughters. Each vied for his favor. Each sought to rise in this gilded cage. A smile could become a weapon, a tear a tool. They spoke in gentle tones, their faces serene, but their words were daggers, their schemes as sharp as any blade for every woman in the harem. Power was the true desire. A concubine who caught the Sultan's eye could rise to become Haseki Sultan, his favorite and most powerful consort. Her children could become princes. Her words could shape the Sultan's will. But favor was a fragile thing. A glance, a gesture, a single word could turn love to scorn, and so the Sultan, who ruled an empire of millions, was surrounded by a court of shadow queens. Each smiled as she bowed, each whispered in his ear, each sought to bend him to her will. His heart was a battlefield, his mind a prize. And though he was the master of the empire, he was also a captive, a king within a web of silken intrigue, the price of favor. But for every woman who rose to power in the harem, there were countless others who fell. Young girls were brought here from distant lands, their wide eyes filled with hope or fear. Some came willingly, daughters of noble families who saw the harem as a path to wealth and honor. Others were captured in war, their chains replaced by jeweled anklets. They came as flowers, but few bloomed. The first lesson they learned was obedience. Eunuchs, silent and watchful, taught them the ways of the palace. They learned to bow, to speak only when spoken to smile even when their hearts ached. But behind this discipline was another lesson, the lesson of survival. For in the harem, beauty was not enough. A woman's life depended on her wits. Her charm, her ability to capture the Sultan's gaze. Rivalries were born in quiet whispers. A compliment could hide a threat. A gift could conceal poison. Alliances were made and broken with a glance. Some girls, forgotten by the Sultan, withered away in lonely chambers, their beauty fading beneath the weight of despair. Others, whose charms drew his eye, found themselves showered with jewels, but surrounded by silent enemies. But even those who won the Sultan's favor found that love was a double-edged sword. For with each smile, each whispered promise, they drew closer to danger. A favored concubine could become a queen, but she could also become a target. The Sultan's love was a treasure, but it was a treasure others would kill to steal. In this world of silk and shadow, lives were broken as easily as delicate glass. A jealous rival could whisper a lie. A false friend could betray a secret. A woman who danced beneath the lanterns one night could vanish without a trace the next. In the harem, favor was a dream, but it was a dream that could become a nightmare. The poison petal sauce the centuries passed. The beauty of the harem became a prison. What had once been a garden of grace and charm turned into a den of whispers and betrayal. The empire outside its walls began to decay, but within the harem, the struggle for power only grew more desperate. Sultans became distant figures, more interested in pleasure than in rule. They lingered within the harem, surrounded by music and laughter while their empire crumbled. But the laughter was hollow, and the smiles were sharp. For the women of the harem, each day was a silent battle. They adorned themselves in jewels, their faces serene, but their hearts were filled with fear, betrayals multiplied. A cup of sweet sherbet could hide poison. A trusted servant could become a spy. Even the Valide Sultan, the once mighty queen, mother, could find herself cast aside by younger, more cunning rivals. Sisters turned against sisters. Mothers whispered against daughters. The beauty of the harem was a mask, hiding a world of shadows, and beyond the walls of this silken prison, the empire itself decayed. Ottoman armies faltered. Ottoman sultans became puppets of foreign powers. But within the harem, the struggle for favor never ceased. Each woman was a pawn in a silent war, each smile a mask, each word a weapon, for the harem, once a place of beauty and power, had become a garden of poison petals. And as the empire's greatness withered, so too did the light within those. Silken walls died in the end. The harem became a memory, a whisper of beauty and betrayal, a world where love was a weapon and power was a dream wrapped in shadow. Chapter 15. The Ottoman Golden Age of Art and Science in the heart of Istanbul, where the blue waters of the Bosphorus met the ancient streets. A quiet revolution unfolded, not one of swords and armies, but of words, ideas, and art. It was a time when the Ottoman Empire, known for its might and conquest, became a beacon of wisdom. The city's libraries grew thick with manuscripts, their shelves bending beneath the weight of knowledge. Scholars from across the world came here, their minds hungry for the treasures of ancient thought. Under the golden domes of grand libraries, the whispers of old philosophers were brought back to life. Arabic, Persian, Greek, and Latin texts were translated by the careful hands of Ottoman scholars. Ancient wisdom, which had once been the pride of Greece, Persia, and India, was preserved and expanded upon. Medicine, mathematics, astronomy, each field found a new home within these gardens of knowledge. The works of Galen and Hippocrates were studied alongside the discoveries of Ibn Sina, and the stars were mapped with a precision that matched the heavens themselves. In the quiet halls of madrasas, young minds bent over their books, their fingers tracing the elegant lines of calligraphy. The study of logic became a puzzle, geometry a dance of perfect shapes. Teachers spoke of the wonders of the human body, the secrets of the stars, and the mysteries of the soul. The air was filled with the scent of ink and the soft rustle of parchment, but it was not just the scholars who thrived. Poets wandered the gardens of Topkapi, their verses drifting like soft petals on the wind. They spoke of love and longing, of battles won and hearts broken. Their words were not just lines of rhyme, but threads that wove the soul of the empire. In the coffee houses of Istanbul, men gathered to recite these poems, their voices rising and falling in soft, rhythmic waves. The Ottoman Empire, which had once conquered cities with iron and fire, now conquered the mind with words and wisdom. It became a sanctuary for thought, a haven for those who sought to understand the world. And as the call to prayer echoed across the city's minarets, another call was heard, a call to learn, to question, to dream the dome of beauty. But knowledge was not the only treasure of the Ottoman Golden Age. Beneath the wide sky of Istanbul, great domes rose like mountains of marble and gold. It was an age when architecture became poetry, and the hands of builders shaped beauty from stone. And among them, one name shone brightest, Mimar Sinan. Sinan was more than an architect. He was a poet of stone. His works transformed the cities. Skyline, each mosque a prayer carved into the sky. The Sulaimani Mosque, with its vast dome rising like a soft silver cloud, stood as a testament to his genius. Its courtyards were filled with the murmur of fountains, its halls with the soft glow of stained glass. But it was not just a building. It was a vision, a place where the soul could rise as high as the minarets. Sinan's genius did not end with mosques. He built bridges that danced over rivers, palaces that sparkled by the waters of the Bosphorus, and fountains that whispered in the shade of cypress trees. His designs were a marriage of strength and grace, of elegance and purpose. Each column, each arch, each delicate tile spoke of harmony, but Sinan was not alone. A generation of builders, inspired by his vision, turned Istanbul into a city of wonders. Minarets reached for the sky, their pointed tips piercing the blue heavens. Courtyards bloomed with gardens where roses spilled over marble fountains. Palaces glittered with gold and silver, their windows opening to views of the sparkling sea. The beauty of Ottoman architecture was not just in its size, but in its soul. Each mosque was not just a place of prayer, but a sanctuary for the weary, a refuge for the faithful. Each palace was a poem, each garden a dream. And even as the empire's armies marched across distant lands, its true treasure lay here in the quiet, sacred spaces where beauty touched the soul, the weavers of silk. And words beyond the grand domes and marble halls, the beauty of the Ottoman Golden Age spread like a silken thread. Weavers, painters, and poets became the true storytellers of the empire. Turkish carpets, with their vibrant colors and intricate designs, flowed like rivers of art. Each knot was a story, each thread a whisper of tradition. Flowers, stars, and geometric patterns danced beneath the hands of weavers who had learned their craft from generations before them. But it was not just carpets that told tales. In quiet workshops, artists bent over tiny sheets of paper, their brushes dipped in colors that seemed to glow. Miniature paintings, delicate, detailed, and vibrant, captured the empire's stories. Sultans rode forth in golden armor. Ships sailed upon sapphire seas, and lovers whispered beneath the shade of tall cypress trees. Each painting was a world, each brushstroke a verse, and then there was calligraphy, the art of the written word. The words of poets and philosophers were not just written. They were painted, each letter a curve of grace. Quranic verses danced across silk scrolls, their golden letters a testament to faith. The names of sultans were written with a flourish, their titles curling like soft waves. In the hands of master calligraphers, even a single word became a masterpiece. But words were not just written, they were spoken, sung, and shared. Poets wandered from court to court, their voices rising in verses of love, of loss, of longing. In coffee houses, where the scent of roasted beans mingled with the smoke of hookahs, storytellers spun tales of heroes and lovers, of wise men and foolish kings. The Ottoman Empire was a realm of silk and words, of stories woven and whispered. Its true wealth lay not in gold or silver, but in the beauty that its people created, a beauty that touched the soul, a beauty that time could not erase, a legacy in stone and sun-given. As the empire's power began to fade, its beauty remained. The armies that had once marched across 3 continents grew weary. The flags of conquest were folded away. But the art, the poetry, the wisdom of the Ottoman Golden Age endured. The great mosques still stood, their domes casting soft shadows over the bustling streets. The marble courtyards still echoed with the soft whisper of fountains, their water sparkling beneath the sunlight. The palaces by the Bosphorus still glittered, their walls alive with the colors of dawn and dusk, and in quiet libraries, the books of Ottoman scholars whispered their secrets to those who would listen. The works of poets and philosophers once, read by sultans, now spoke to all who sought wisdom. Their verses danced across pages of gold. Their thoughts flowed like rivers of ink, carpets woven with love and care still adorned the floors of distant lands, their colors a reminder of the weavers who had spun them. Miniature paintings, delicate and bright, told the stories of empires and lovers. And the elegant curls of Ottoman calligraphy graced the walls of mosques, a silent song of faith and beauty. The Ottoman Empire, which had once conquered lands and ruled over millions, found its true immortality not in its armies, but in its art. Even as its power waned, its culture bloomed. Like a garden whose flowers never fade, its beauty touched the world, and so the legacy of the Ottoman Golden Age of art and science became a gift to the world, a gift of beauty and wisdom that would never be forgotten. Chapter 16, The Sultan's Court and Power in the heart of Istanbul, where the sea winds whispered against ancient walls and the minarets of Hagia Sophia reached for the sky, there stood a place that was neither a palace nor a fortress, yet it held the pulse of the Ottoman Empire, the Sublime Porte. This was not just a gateway, but a name that spoke of power, of whispers, and of decisions that shaped the lives of millions. Within its grand halls, the Grand Vizier reigned, the Sultan's right hand, the voice that spoke in his name. But the Sublime Porte was not just his domain. It was a world of advisors and scribes, of secretaries who scribbled furiously on parchment, their quills scratching like whispers in the dim light. It was here that the empire's commands were written, its laws decreed, and its treaties signed. But power, even in this grand hall, was a delicate dance. The Grand Vizier was the Sultan's servant, but he was also a master of the empire's politics. He knew that each decree he signed could be his rise or his ruin. Beneath his calm face lay a storm of calculations. To please the Sultan was to survive, but to displease him was to fall sometimes by a whispered order, sometimes by the edge of a silent blade dot in the corridors beyond the great hall. Ministers whispered to one another, their robes rustling like shadows. Favors were traded as easily as coins. A word of praise could become a weapon. A gesture of friendship could become a trap. Even as the empire's armies marched across distant lands, the true battles were fought here with words instead of swords. Yet, the Sublime Porte was not just a place of whispers. It was the beating heart of the Ottoman state. Here, the taxes of distant provinces were counted, the fates of captives decided, the terms of peace and war written in ink. To serve here was to stand in the shadow of the Sultan's will. To rise here was to touch power and to risk everything, for in this world of marble and shadow, where titles meant nothing without favor, even the Grand Vizier was just a pawn who played a dangerous game. The diplomats and spy power was not only a game played among Ottoman courtiers. Beyond the great walls of the Sublime Porte, a different dance unfolded, a dance of diplomats and spies. Istanbul was not just the capital of an empire. It was a crossroads of the world. Ambassadors came from Europe, Persia, Africa, and beyond. They arrived in splendid carriages, their robes shimmering with silk and gold. But beneath their fine manners and charming smiles, they were more than mere guests. The French ambassador, with his polite bow, was a master of subtle threats. The Venetian envoy, with his charming smile, was a master of quiet persuasion. The Persian emissary, with his jeweled turban, carried not just gifts, but whispered secrets. Each came to the Sultan's court with treaties in one hand and daggers in the other. For in the world of diplomacy, words were weapons, and every gesture held a hidden meaning. They met in grand halls, beneath ceilings painted with scenes of paradise. They dined at long tables where silver goblets shone beneath the glow of 1,000 candles. Toasts were raised, smiles exchanged, but each man's eyes watched for the slightest hint of betrayal. Promises were made, only to be broken. Secrets were whispered over cups of sweet sherbet, while agents watched from the shadows. But diplomacy was not only a game of words. It was also a dance of shadows. Spies moved like silent ghosts through the bustling streets of Istanbul. Some were merchants, who listened carefully as they traded spices and silks. Others were servants who seemed to bow with humility, but heard every whispered plan. Letters passed in secret. Codes were written in invisible ink. Even the walls seemed to have ears. The Sultan himself knew that every diplomat was also a potential spy, every treaty a potential trap. He listened to their flattering words, but he trusted only his own eyes. For in this world of shifting loyalties, the greatest weapon was not the sword, but the secret and the sublime port, where laws were written and treaties signed, was a stage where every word was a move in a deadly game. The poisoned cup but power in the Sultan's court was a double-edged sword. Ambition brought men to the heights of glory, but it also led them to the shadow of death. The Grand Vizier, who stood so close to the Sultan's throne, also stood closest to the blade. For in the palace of Topkapi, where the Sultan's will was law, a whispered accusation could be a death sentence. History was filled with the names of those who had risen and fallen in the blink of an eye. A vizier who had once dined with the Sultan could find himself dragged through the palace corridors, his jeweled robes stained with dust. A toast raised in his honor could become a final farewell. The Sultan's smile could become a frown, and a frown could become a death sentence. The poisoned cup was more than a legend. It was a reality, a quiet whisper of death that had touched many hands. In the kitchens of the palace, where silver goblets were polished to a mirror's shine, there were servants who knew which cup was safe and which was not. The Sultan himself dined in careful isolation, his food tasted by trusted servants. But even trust was a fragile thing. Beyond the feasts, the gardens of the palace were silent witnesses to many quiet deaths. A man who walked among the roses in the morning could be found dead beneath the cypress trees by evening. Those who rose too high, who whispered too boldly, who reached too far, found that power was a poison that could flow not just through a cup, but through a glance, a word, a smile dot in the Sultan's court. Power was a dream, but it was a dream that could become a nightmare. The weight of the crown ate even as viziers rose and fell, even as diplomats whispered and spies prowled. There was one figure who seemed to stand above it all, the Sultan himself. Clad in silks of deep crimson, crowned with a jeweled turban, he seemed to be the master of this grand game. His word was law. His gaze could shape fates. He was the shadow behind the throne, the sun around which all power revolved. But even for the Sultan, power was a burden. The great halls of Topkapi were his domain, but they were also his prison. Beneath the golden domes, He was watched by his own guards, advised by his own enemies, and surrounded by whispers that never ceased. Each smile could be false, each promise a trap. Even his own sons could become rivals. The Sultan's nights were filled with feasts, but his dreams were haunted. He knew that his life, his throne, depended on a delicate balance. A favored vizier could become a traitor. A trusted brother could become a rival. His own family, his own blood, could become his greatest danger. The crown he wore was heavy with jewels, but heavier still with fear, and yet, for all his power, he was as much a captive of the palace as those who served him. His world was a world of walls of marble, walls of silver, and walls of shadows. He ruled an empire, but he was never truly free. The crown that glittered beneath the light of 1,000 candles was a chain, and so the Sultan's court, with all its beauty and grandeur, was a place of silent despair. A world where power was a dance, but where every step could lead to a fall. A world where even the greatest king was a prisoner of his own throne, and as the call to prayer echoed over the city, the Sultan would stand alone, watching the sky darken. Over the Bosphorus, wondering which of those who smiled at him that day would be the one to betray him. Chapter 17. The Empire's Crescent Decline. The empire was vast, but its strength was withering. Once, the Ottoman armies had marched with banners high and drums thundering. They had stormed the walls of Constantinople, ridden across the deserts of Arabia, and cast their shadow over Europe. But those days were fading, and in their place came an age of endless wars that drained the empire's blood and spirit. A tea began with Russia. The great bear of the north looked southward, hungry for warm waters and ancient cities. The Russian Tsars saw the Ottoman lands as ripe for conquest, a crumbling fortress waiting to be claimed. In the frozen fields of Crimea, Ottoman soldiers faced Russian cannons that roared like thunder. The wind carried the scent of snow and smoke, and the earth was stained red with the blood of young men who never returned home. But Russia was not the only threat. To the west, the Austrian Habsburgs pressed against the Ottoman borders, their armies marching with iron discipline. Fortress after fortress fell, and the once proud Ottoman cavalry found itself outmatched by modern rifles and artillery. The clash of swords gave way to the crack of muskets, the thunder of cannons drowning out the call to prayer. In the east, Persia, too, sought to claim Ottoman lands. Their cavalry swept across the mountains, their banners fluttering in the desert. Wind, villages burned, and the cries of the wounded echoed through the valleys. The Ottomans, who had once been conquerors, now found themselves defending crumbling walls and fading borders. The empire's armies were tired, its soldiers poorly equipped, their spirits broken. The Janissaries, once the iron heart of the Ottoman military, had become a shadow of their former selves. Discipline was replaced by greed, loyalty by corruption. Generals quarreled, ministers plotted, and the Sultan's commands were whispered rather than obeyed. And as the years passed, the wars did not end. Each new conflict drained the treasury. Each defeat left a scar. The Ottoman Empire, which had once been feared, was now known as the sick man of Europe, a giant, weakened and weary, its body scarred by the wounds of endless battles. The Tanzimat reforms, but in the shadow of defeat, a flicker of hope remained. In the grand halls of Istanbul, voices rose in debate. Some spoke of a return to the old ways of swords and conquest, but others spoke of change, of a new path, a path that might save the empire from decay. And so began the Tanzimat reforms.it was a bold dream. The empire, they said, must become something new. The old ways of feudal lords and ancient traditions would be replaced by law, by education, by industry. The Ottoman state, which had once been ruled by the whim of sultans and pashas, would become a land of justice and progress. Railways were built, iron tracks stretching like silver threads across the vast empire. Steam engines chugged through. The mountains, their smoke rising like soft clouds against the clear sky. Goods moved faster, armies marched quicker, and distant provinces felt a little closer. The call to prayer now mixed with the whistle of trains. Schools were founded, their doors open, not just to the sons of the wealthy, but to all. Boys and girls learned to read and write, their fingers tracing the elegant lines of Arabic script. Teachers spoke of science, of history, of a world beyond the old walls of the city. Knowledge, once the treasure of scholars, now became the right of all. Laws were written, clear, and just, promising the rights of life, property, and freedom. No longer would men be punished by the whims of a pasha. No longer would the courts be places of shadows and bribes. A new code of justice was born, its words carved in marble, its promises whispered in the crowded streets, but change is never easy. The old lords of the empire saw these reforms as a threat. The janissaries who had once ruled the battlefield now found themselves cast aside. Ministers whispered of betrayal, of foreign influence, of a loss of faith. And in the coffee houses of Istanbul, men spoke of the empire as a sick tree, its roots rotting even as its branches reached for the sky. The Tanzimat reforms were a dream of a new Ottoman Empire. But even as railways were built and schools opened, the soul of the empire seemed to fade. The sultans who had once been the shadow of God on earth now seemed like distant figures, their voices drowned in the noise of change, the Eastern question. But the Ottoman Empire was not just a land of sultans and soldiers. It was a prize, a jewel that glimmered beneath the greedy eyes of Europe. And as the empire grew weaker, the great powers of the world gathered around it, like wolves around a wounded deer. This was the Eastern question, a question of who would claim the spoils. Britain watched with cold calculation, its ships patrolling the waters of the Mediterranean, its diplomats whispering in the Sultan's ear. The British spoke of friendship, but their eyes were on the trade routes of the East, on the riches of India, on the warm waters of the Suez Canal. They would protect the Ottoman Empire, but only as long as it served their interests. France, too, moved in the shadows. Its soldiers marched to North Africa. Its traders filled the markets of Syria. The French spoke of civilization, of culture, of faith. But behind their smiles lay a hunger for empire. To them, the Ottoman lands were a prize to be claimed, a stage. For their own glory, and Russia, always the great shadow to the north, saw itself as the protector of Orthodox Christians in Ottoman lands. The czars spoke of faith, of holy cities, of a destiny that stretched southward. But their armies spoke of conquest, of a dream that reached the shores of the Black Sea and the walls of Istanbul. The Sultan, trapped in his palace, found himself surrounded by smiling enemies. Treaties were signed, promises made, but each promise was a trap, each treaty a chain. The empire, once a mighty fortress, became a pawn on the chessboard of Europe. Diplomats dined beneath the golden domes of Istanbul. But their words were daggers, and their smiles were masks. The Eastern question was a game of shadows, a dance of knives. And the empire was caught at its heart, struggling to breathe as the world closed in around it. The Sultan's final tear sand, at the heart of this storm, stood Sultan Abdul Hamid II. He was a man who dreamed of power, who spoke of faith, who saw himself as the last great sultan of a mighty empire. But his dreams were made of shadows, and his rule was one of fear. Abdul Hamid was a man who trusted no one. His palace was a fortress. His guards were shadows. He read the reports of his spies, his fingers tracing the delicate lines of parchment. He saw plots everywhere, and sometimes he was right. Ministers whispered behind his back, generals plotted in secret, and foreign powers smiled with empty promises. But Abdul Hamid was not a man of despair. He dreamed of a powerful empire, of a people united beneath the crescent moon. He built schools, he founded railways, he spoke of progress. But his dream was poisoned by fear. His hope turned to suspicion. His reign became a time of shadows, of secret police who listened in the dark, of prisoners who vanished beneath the silent waters of the Bosphorus. His palace, with its glittering chandeliers and silken curtains, became a prison of paranoia, and yet, for all his power, he could not stop the storm. The empire slipped through his fingers, its lands lost to foreign powers, its strength drained by endless wars. Abdul Hamid watched as the flags of Europe fluttered over Ottoman lands, as the whispers of revolution rose in the streets. In his final years, the great sultan who had dreamed of glory saw only the shadow of defeat. He was a prisoner in his own palace, a ruler without rule. His dreams were ashes, his empire a fading shadow, and as he gazed out over the waters of the Bosphorus, where the ships of foreign powers sailed freely, a tear fell, the final tear of a sultan who had lost everything. Chapter 18. The Dance of Empires in the rugged mountains of the Balkans, where mist clung to the pines and rivers whispered through narrow valleys, a storm was brewing. It was not a storm of rain or thunder, but of rebellion, a quiet murmur that grew louder with each passing year. The Ottoman Empire, which had once marched across these lands with iron and fire, now found itself facing the bitter winds of change. For centuries, the Balkans had been a mosaic of faiths and peoples. Orthodox Christians, Catholics, Muslims. They lived side by side, their villages scattered like stars across the green hills. But beneath the peaceful surface, a quiet longing stirred. Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece each dreamt of freedom, of a land ruled not by a distant sultan in Istanbul, but by kings of their own blood. The spark came in Serbia, a land of rugged warriors and proud chieftains, where the memory of lost battles was whispered around campfires. The Serbians rose, their villages becoming fortresses, their hills a shield. Ottoman soldiers marched into the mountains, their banners fluttering in the cold wind. But the forests were alive with the sound of gunfire, and each fallen soldier became a martyr to a cause that would not die. In Bulgaria, too, the dream of freedom stirred. Rebels armed with little more than rusted rifles hid among the thick forests, striking at Ottoman patrols. Villages were burned, families torn apart. But the dream of independence did not fade. It was whispered in prayers, sung in secret songs, carried like a flame through the darkness. Greece, whose islands sparkled beneath the blue Aegean sky, had already won its freedom years before. But now its people looked northward to the lands. Still under Ottoman rule, they saw brothers and sisters waiting for liberation, a destiny waiting to be fulfilled. Greek soldiers crossed the mountains, their rifles sharp, their hearts fierce, and as the fires of rebellion spread, the Ottoman Empire found itself trapped in a storm. Its armies marched, its generals issued orders, but each victory was a wound. For each village burned, 1,000 more took up the cry for freedom. The Balkans had become a tempest, a storm that the empire could not tame. The loss of Europe as the storm raged in the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire's grasp on Europe began to slip. Cities that had once flown the crescent banner now raised their own flags. Lands that had paid tribute to the Sultan now declared their independence. Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece each carved its own path, each claimed its own freedom. The empire, which had once been a giant that cast its shadow over the Christian kingdoms of Europe, now found itself shrinking. The great fortresses that had once guarded its borders were abandoned. The garrisons that had once stood proud now retreated. Each step back was a loss, each retreat a wound, but it was not just the rebels who tore at the empire. The great powers of Europe watched with hungry eyes. Russia, always the great shadow to the north, spoke of protecting Orthodox Christians, but its true aim was conquest. Austria-Hungary whispered of peace, but moved its armies closer to Ottoman lands. Britain and France, their ships sailing the blue waters of the Mediterranean, spoke of friendship, but prepared for profit. The Ottoman Empire, which had once been the master of these lands, was now a pawn in a game played by others. Diplomats met in grand halls, treaties were signed, and each treaty was another chain. The lands of the Balkans, which had once been the empire's heart, were now slipping away. Sarajevo, a city of narrow streets and ancient mosques, whispered of war. The whispers grew louder, spreading through the mountains, across the rivers, through the valleys. The Ottoman dream of a European empire was dying, its lands fading like shadows beneath the rising sun and on the shores of the Bosphorus where the waters shimmered beneath the pale sky. The Sultan watched as Europe slipped away. His empire, which had once been the terror of kings, was now a fading memory. The Balkan Wars, the final blow came with the Balkan Wars. A brutal struggle that saw armies march and cities burn, a struggle where the Ottoman dream of Europe was torn apart. In 1912, the kingdoms of the Balkans, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro united against the Ottoman Empire. They were a coalition of rivals, but in the face of the empire, they stood as one. Ottoman soldiers marched to the front, their faces weary, their rifles old. They fought with courage, but courage alone could not hold back the storm. The mountains of Macedonia, the plains of Thrace, these were fields soaked with blood, fields where the pride of the Ottoman army was shattered. The battles were fierce. Ottoman fortresses fell beneath the thunder of artillery. Villages were set aflame, their smoke rising like dark ghosts against the sky. Families fled, their belongings carried on their backs, their faces etched with fear. The roads of Europe were filled with refugees, men, women, and children who had once called these lands home, but who now had nothing. Cities that had once been the pride of the empire became graveyards. Adrianople, the jewel of Thrace, was besieged, its walls crumbling beneath the cannons of the Balkan League. The Ottoman flag, which had once flown high above the city, was torn down. The crescent moon and star, which had once been a symbol of power, now seemed like a distant memory, but the wars did not end. A second Balkan War erupted as the victors turned on each other, their unity shattered by greed. And in the chaos, the Ottoman Empire could do nothing but watch. It was a shadow on the edge of the storm, a fading giant trapped in a dance of death. Refugees flooded into Anatolia, the wounded remnants of a fading power. They came with stories of lost homes, of burning villages, of the lands they had left behind. They came with hope, but they found only a land struggling to survive. The Balkan Wars were not just a loss of land. They were a loss of pride, a loss of faith, a loss of hope. The Ottoman Empire, which had once been the master of these lands, was now a ghost, the ghosts of glory in the grand halls of Topkapi Palace, where golden chandeliers shimmered beneath. Painted ceilings, shadows gathered. The Sultan's court, once a place of power and splendor, had become a hall of whispers. Ministers spoke of defeats, of lost lands, of treaties that stripped the empire of its strength. Generals who had once marched with pride now bowed their heads in shame, but it was not just the court that was haunted. The empire itself seemed to fade, its glory a distant memory. The cities of Europe, which had once trembled beneath the Ottoman banners, now laughed at the Sultan's weakness. The great powers of Europe, Britain, France, Russia, spoke of the Ottomans as a dying empire, a land to be carved up like a feast. The streets of Istanbul, once filled with the noise of merchants and the laughter of children, seemed quieter. Refugees crowded the city's alleyways, their eyes filled with sorrow. Mosques that had once echoed with the call to prayer now seemed to whisper of defeat. The Sultan, who had once ruled over 3 continents, was now a prisoner of his own palace. His dreams of glory were haunted by the ghosts of lost lands, his prayers unanswered. The empire, which had once been a crescent that rose over the world, was now a crescent that faded in the twilight. But even as the world changed, the Ottoman Empire seemed trapped in time, a shadow of what it had been, a memory that refused to fade. And the Sultan, who sat upon a throne of silk and gold, watched as the world slipped away. The dance of empires continued, but the Ottoman Empire was no longer a dancer. It was a ghost that whispered of glory, of power, of a dream. That had died, and as the waters of the Bosphorus shimmered beneath the pale moonlight, the empire that had once been the terror of Europe became a fading shadow. A shadow that whispered of what it had been and of what it could never be again. Chapter 20. The Phoenix of Anatolia amidst the crumbling remains of the Ottoman Empire. The twilight of a centuries-old dynasty cast a shadow over Anatolia. Once the heart of a vast empire, the land was now a battlefield of foreign ambitions and lost hope. The Sultan, weak and subdued, signed away the sovereignty of his people, ceding control to foreign powers. Constantinople, the fabled city of minarets and domes, stood silent under the shadow of foreign flags, but in the quiet streets and misty mountains of Anatolia, a different fire began to burn. It was not the fire of destruction, but of defiance. And at its heart stood a man, Mustafa Kemal, a soldier of iron will, a strategist whose eyes saw beyond the chaos. To the people of Anatolia, he was not just a general. He was a promise that the Turkish nation would not kneel. Kemal rejected the treaties that chained his homeland, declaring them nothing but a piece of paper written by those who had no right to divide his land. In the mountain towns, in the silent plains, and along the rugged coastline, his call echoed, a call for freedom, for dignity, for a land free of foreign rule. Villagers whispered his name in their homes. Soldiers who had laid down their arms once more took them up. A network of resistance began to grow, silent but unbreakable. Kemal gathered the loyal, the brave, the desperate men and women who had nothing left to lose but everything to gain. They came from villages scorched by war, from towns turned into graveyards, and from the bustling streets of cities clutched by fear. In the mountains, they trained in secret. In the villages, they gathered supplies. And from the ashes of a fallen empire, the first sparks of a new nation began to glow. The war of independence, the earth trembled beneath the march of countless boots, the air thick with the smoke of burning villages. Across the dusty plains of Anatolia, the Turkish resistance rose like a storm. Under the command of Mustafa Kemal, they faced a formidable enemy, Greek forces, equipped, trained, and determined to carve a new realm from the ruins of Ottoman lands. But the Turkish fighters were more than just soldiers. They were farmers who had left their fields, fishermen who had abandoned the seas, and shepherds who had exchanged their crooks for rifles. They did not fight for conquest, but for survival. And this fire of desperation made them unyielding. In the mountain passes, Turkish marksmen struck from the mist, disappearing like ghosts. In the valleys, small villages turned into fortresses, defending their streets with whatever they could find. Women carried supplies on their backs, and children served as messengers, darting through the forests with the courage of seasoned scouts. The Greek forces pushed deep into Anatolia, but they found not a land waiting to be conquered, but a nation refusing to die. Day by day, battle by battle, the tide turned. At the bloody fields of Sakarya, Mustafa Kemal's leadership transformed retreat into resilience, defense into defiance. The Turkish soldiers, tired but unbroken, pushed the Greek invaders back, step by painful step. Flames danced on the horizon as villages were set alight, but they were not the flames of defeat. They were the burning symbols of a people who refused to be chained. The Greek army, once confident, now found itself driven to the Aegean. Its dreams of conquest shattered. The war of independence was not just a clash of armies. It was a struggle of spirit, a battle for the soul of Anatolia. And in the hearts of the Turkish people, a new nation was born. The Republic of Turkey. Victory came not just as a triumph of arms, but as a rebirth of hope. In the city of Ankara, far from the ancient shadow of Constantinople, a new flag was raised, the red banner of Turkey, with its crescent moon and star, a symbol of resilience against the dark. Mustafa Kemal, now called Atatürk, the father of the Turks, stood before the gathering crowds, not as a conqueror, but as a builder. The Sultanate was abolished, its long, ancient line reduced to a memory. The Ottoman Caliphate, once the spiritual seat of the Muslim world, was cast into the pages of history. In its place stood a republic, a nation born not of royal blood, but of the will of its people. Atatürk's vision went beyond mere independence. He saw a land that would not only survive but thrive. Reforms swept through the newborn state. Education became a light for the young, no longer a privilege for the few. The language, written in the flowing script of the Ottomans, was transformed into a Latin alphabet, a bridge between the past and the modern world. Women, once bound by the shadows of tradition, found their voices in schools, in courts, and even in the halls of government. Secular laws replaced the old religious codes, and science and reason were held as the guiding stars of the new republic. But change was not without struggle. Those who clung to the past resisted, whispering a betrayal and sacrilege. Yet Atat-Rike did not waver. With each new law, each new reform, he carved a nation out of the ashes of empire. The Turkish Republic was not merely a state. It was a vision, a dream forged in the fires of war and the hopes of millions, the end of an era on November 1922, the final act of a centuries-old empire played out in silent sorrow. The Ottoman Sultanate, once the seat of caliphs and conquerors, was officially abolished. Its grand palaces, with their golden domes and marble halls, became mere monuments of a forgotten age. Sultan Mehmed VI, once the ruler of an empire that, stretched across continents, stood as a man without a throne. Surrounded by courtiers who whispered empty comforts, he watched as his world crumbled. On a quiet morning, escorted by British officers, the Sultan boarded a British warship, a vessel meant for foreign seas, but now a ferry for a fallen monarch. Constantinople, the jewel of the Bosphorus, watched in silence as the ship's gray silhouette vanished into the mist. The Sultan, once the shadow of God on earth, was now a refugee, a relic of a past that had been swept away. The world turned, and in Anatolia, a new nation took its first breath. The palaces of the Sultan stood empty, their silent corridors echoing with forgotten whispers. But in the streets of Ankara, in the fields of Anatolia, and in the hearts of the Turkish people, a new spirit was born. The Ottoman Empire was gone, but from its ashes, the Republic of Turkey had risen a phoenix of Anatolia, a dream that refused to die.